What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this video, there are search teams combing through the Appalachian wilderness, looking for people who simply vanished without a trace? We're talking about experienced hikers, local residents who knew these mountains like their own backyard, even entire families who disappeared from locations where disappearing should be impossible. Today we're diving into 11 real cases that happened across these ancient mountains, and I guarantee at least one of them is going to stick with you long after this video ends. Make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears with notifications on, because we investigate the cases others won't touch. And drop a comment letting me know which story hit you the hardest. Let's move to our first story. The Brown Mountain Lights have haunted the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina for over 2.5 centuries, making them one of the oldest continuously documented paranormal phenomena in American history. What started as scattered reports from German settlers has evolved into thousands of eyewitness accounts, scientific investigations, and a mystery that refuses to die despite our best efforts to explain it away. The first recorded sighting dates back to 1771, when German engineer John William Gerard de Brom was surveying the North Carolina wilderness for the colonial government. De Brom was a methodical man, trained in precision and documentation, which makes his account all the more compelling. In his surveying notes, he described bright, luminous objects rising from the valleys around Brown Mountain, objects that moved with purpose and intelligence, defying every natural explanation he could conceive. De Brom was no superstitious frontiersman. He was educated, rational, and had spent years mapping the treacherous Appalachian terrain. Yet here he was, documenting lights that seemed to dance through the mountain air with a life of their own. The Cherokee people had their own explanation for these mysterious illuminations, one that predates de Brom's encounter by generations. According to tribal oral tradition, the lights are the spirits of Cherokee and Catawba women, eternally searching the mountainsides for their husbands and sons who died in a great battle on Brown Mountain. The warriors had gone to settle a territorial dispute, but when they failed to return, their women took torches and combed the ridges and valleys, calling out into the darkness. The Cherokee elders say these women never stopped searching, and their torch lights can still be seen on clear nights, moving through the forests where their loved ones fell. It's a beautiful and tragic explanation, one that speaks to the deep spiritual connection between the Cherokee people and the Appalachian landscape they called home for thousands of years. But the Cherokee legend, while poetic, doesn't account for the sheer consistency of modern sightings. Throughout the 1800s, settlers and travelers continued to report the same phenomenon. Glowing orbs that appeared to rise from the valleys, hover at treetop level, and move in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random natural occurrence. These weren't fleeting glimpses or easily dismissed hallucinations. Witnesses described lights that would appear for minutes at a time, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, always maintaining the same general characteristics. A yellowish or reddish glow, about the size of a basketball, moving at varying speeds through the mountain air. The mystery gained national attention in 1913 when the Smithsonian Institution sent a team to investigate the Brown Mountain Lights. This wasn't some fringe paranormal group or local curiosity seekers. This was America's premier scientific institution, taking the reports seriously enough to fund an expedition. The Smithsonian team spent weeks in the area, interviewing witnesses, taking measurements, and attempting to document the phenomenon. What they found frustrated them. The lights appeared regularly, just as witnesses had described. But every natural explanation they tested fell short. They ruled out car headlights, train lights, and reflections from distant towns. The lights appeared in locations where no artificial illumination could possibly originate. and they moved in ways that defied conventional physics. During World War I, something extraordinary happened that should have put the mystery to rest once and for all. A massive flood in 1916 knocked out all electrical power in the region for weeks. Every light bulb, every street lamp, every form of artificial illumination was extinguished. If the brown mountain lights were somehow reflections or refractions of human-made light sources, they should have disappeared completely during this blackout period. Instead, witnesses reported that the lights continued to appear with the same frequency and intensity as before. The lights were not dependent on human technology. They were something else entirely. The United States Geological Survey got involved in 1922, sending geologist George Rogers Mansfield to conduct a thorough investigation. Mansfield approached the mystery with scientific rigor, spending months in the area and interviewing dozens of witnesses. His preliminary findings seemed to offer a rational explanation. He theorized that the lights were the result of automobile headlights and locomotive headlights being refracted through atmospheric conditions unique to the mountain topography. It was a plausible theory that satisfied skeptics and seemed to close the case. However, Mansfield's explanation had a fatal flaw that he himself acknowledged. Many of the most credible sightings occurred in areas where no roads or railways existed, and some of the historical accounts predated the invention of both automobiles and electric locomotives in the region. The phenomenon continued unabated through the Great Depression and World War II. Local residents, park rangers, and visitors to the newly established Blue Ridge Parkway continued to report the same mysterious lights. In 1962, the United States Forest Service decided to tackle the mystery once more, using more advanced equipment and methodologies than previous investigations. They set up observation stations equipped with telescopes, cameras, and atmospheric monitoring equipment. Over the course of several months, Forest Service researchers documented numerous light phenomena that matched witness descriptions. However, their sophisticated equipment revealed something disturbing. The lights appeared to emit no heat signature and registered no electromagnetic activity. Whatever was creating these illuminations was not behaving according to the known laws of physics. Oak Ridge National Laboratory became interested in the brown mountain lights in the 1970s, drawn by reports of their unusual properties. Using specialized detection equipment originally developed for nuclear research, Oak Ridge scientists attempted to analyze the light's composition and energy source. Their findings were inconclusive, but deeply unsettling. The lights appeared to exist in a state that didn't conform to conventional understanding of matter and energy. They exhibited properties of both particles and waves, similar to quantum phenomena observed in laboratory conditions, but on a macro scale that shouldn't be possible in natural environments. Modern investigations have only deepened the mystery. In the 1990s, Appalachian State University launched a comprehensive study using night vision equipment, infrared cameras, and computer analysis. Over 3 years, they documented over 200 separate light events, categorizing them by color, duration, movement patterns, and atmospheric conditions. What emerged was a disturbing pattern. The lights appeared to respond to human presence. They were more likely to appear when people were actively observing the mountain, and they seemed to modify their behavior based on the number and location of witnesses. This suggested either an impossible level of coincidence or something far more troubling. Intelligence. The most recent scientific investigation occurred in 2016, when a team from the University of North Carolina used drone technology to get closer to the lights than any previous researchers. The drones were equipped with multiple cameras, electromagnetic sensors, and air quality monitors. During one particularly active night, A drone managed to approach within 50 feet of a glowing orb before its electronics mysteriously failed. The footage recovered from the drone's memory card showed the light exhibiting impossible behavior. It appeared to pulse in rhythm with the drone's approach, almost as if it were aware of being observed and studied. Local residents who have lived in the Brown Mountain area for generations have their own theories about the lights, theories that science hasn't been able to address. They speak of patterns in the appearances. Certain times of year when the lights are more active. Certain weather conditions that seem to encourage their manifestation. And most disturbing of all, certain families who seem to attract the phenomenon. There are bloodlines in the region whose members report seeing the lights far more frequently than statistical probability would suggest, as if the lights are somehow connected to specific genetic or familial traits. What makes the Brown Mountain lights particularly unsettling is not just their unexplained nature, but their persistence. This isn't a phenomenon that has faded with time or been explained away by advancing technology. If anything, modern investigation techniques have made the mystery deeper and more troubling. We now have better equipment, more sophisticated understanding of atmospheric physics, and detailed documentation spanning centuries. Yet the lights continue to appear, continue to defy explanation, and continue to suggest that there are aspects of our world that science has yet to comprehend. The Brown Mountain lights represent something profoundly disturbing about the Appalachian Mountains. They are a place where the normal rules don't always apply, where phenomena can persist for centuries without yielding their secrets to human investigation. As we delve deeper into these mountains and the mysteries they hold, we'll discover that the lights of Brown Mountain are just the beginning of a pattern of inexplicable events that have been haunting these ancient peaks for far longer than recorded history can account for. Let's move to our second story. On June 14th, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Lloyd Martin vanished into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park during what should have been a simple family camping trip, triggering the largest search and rescue operation in the park's history, and leaving behind one of the most disturbing unsolved disappearances in Appalachian mountain lore. What happened to Dennis Martin in those Tennessee mountains remains a mystery that has haunted investigators, park officials, and his family for over 5 decades. But the strange circumstances surrounding his disappearance suggest something far more sinister than a simple case of a lost child. The Martin family had arrived at Spence Field, a popular camping area in the Great Smoky Mountains, on June 13th for what was meant to be a relaxing weekend in nature. Dennis was traveling with his father, William Martin, his grandfather, Clyde Martin, and his younger brother, Douglas. They were experienced campers familiar with the outdoors, and the Spence Field area was considered relatively safe. A large open meadow surrounded by well-marked trails with good visibility. The family had camped there before without incident, making the events that followed all the more inexplicable and terrifying. On the afternoon of June 14th, the weather was perfect for hiking. Clear skies, mild temperatures, and excellent visibility. Dennis was playing with several other children from nearby campsites, including the children of another family, the Keys, who had befriended the Martins. The adults were relaxed, confident in the safety of the area and the fact that they could easily see the children playing in the open meadow. At approximately 4:30 p.m., Dennis and 3 other boys decided to play a harmless prank on their families. Their plan was simple. They would split into 2 groups, circle around through the nearby woods, and jump out to surprise the adults when they reconvened. Dennis paired up with the Keys' oldest son, while the 2 younger boys formed the second group. The plan called for them to meet back at the campsite within 15 minutes after completing their circle through the forest. The 2 younger boys successfully completed their loop and emerged from the woods laughing and excited about their successful prank. but Dennis Martin and his partner never appeared. When 15 minutes turned to 30, then 45, the families began to worry. By 5 p.m., with no sign of Dennis, the Keys' son returned alone from the woods, pale and shaken. The boy's account of what happened in those woods would haunt everyone who heard it. He explained that he and Dennis had successfully made their way around the planned route and were heading back toward the campsite when they heard something moving through the trees behind them. At first, they assumed it was the other boys, or perhaps some of the adults, coming to look for them. But as the sound grew closer, the boy realized that whatever was approaching was moving in a way that didn't sound human. The footsteps were too heavy, too irregular, and there was something about the rhythm that made his skin crawl. Both boys had stopped and turned to look back into the forest. And that's when the Keys' son saw something that would change his life forever. Moving through the trees approximately 50 yards behind them was what he could only describe as a figure. Tall, covered in dark hair or fur, walking upright like a man, but with a gait that was wrong, too fluid and too powerful for a human being. The creature appeared to be following their trail deliberately, and when it noticed the boys watching, it stopped and stared directly at them, with what the boy described as intelligent eyes that weren't animal eyes. Terrified, both boys had started running toward the campsite. But somewhere in their panicked flight through the forest, they became separated. The Keys' son emerged from the woods alone, expecting to find Dennis either already at the campsite or arriving shortly behind him. When Dennis failed to appear, the boy reluctantly shared his terrifying encounter with the adults, though he was clearly traumatized and struggled to make them understand the urgency of what he had witnessed. William Martin immediately organized an initial search party from the other campers in the area. They spent the remaining daylight hours calling Dennis's name and combing the nearby forest, but found no trace of the boy. No footprints, no torn clothing, no indication of which direction he might have gone. As darkness fell, the search was temporarily suspended, and park rangers were contacted. What followed was a massive mobilization that would eventually involve over 1,400 searchers, including park rangers, local volunteers, FBI agents, and military personnel. The official search operation began at dawn on June 15th and quickly grew into something unprecedented in the history of the National Park Service. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the mountainous terrain, while ground teams with bloodhounds attempted to pick up Dennis's scent trail. The search dogs presented the first major anomaly in the case. Despite having Dennis's clothing to establish his scent, the dogs seemed confused and agitated in the area where he had disappeared. They would pick up a trail, follow it for a short distance, then stop and whine, refusing to continue. Several experienced handlers noted that the dogs were exhibiting behavior they had never seen before, as if they were encountering something that fundamentally disturbed them. 3 days into the search, on June 17th, a witness came forward with information that would add a deeply disturbing dimension to the case. Harold Key, the father of the boy who had been with Dennis when he disappeared, reported that shortly after the boys had run into the woods, he had seen something that he initially dismissed as unimportant. Key stated that he had observed a rough-looking man, covered in hair or wearing some kind of primitive clothing, moving through the forest in the same general area where the boys had been playing. Key described the figure as moving in a crouched position, as if trying to avoid detection, and noted that it seemed to be carrying something over its shoulder. Key's sighting became even more significant when he revealed that he had seen this figure approximately 30 minutes after Dennis had disappeared, moving in a direction that led deeper into the wilderness and away from all established trails. The timing and location of Key's observation aligned perfectly with the theory that Dennis had been taken by someone or something that had been watching the campsite and waiting for an opportunity. The description of the figure matched what his son had reported seeing in the woods, lending credibility to both accounts and suggesting that Dennis's disappearance was not accidental. As the search operation expanded, other disturbing details began to emerge. Several seasoned park rangers reported finding unusual footprints in the soft soil near the search area. Prints that were larger than any known human foot and showed an unusual gait pattern. These prints appeared to lead from the area where Dennis disappeared deeper into the most remote sections of the park. But the trail became impossible to follow, as it led into rocky terrain where tracking was impossible. The rangers photographed the prints, but the images were later classified and removed from the official case file for reasons that were never publicly explained. Local residents with generational knowledge of the Great Smoky Mountains began sharing stories that park officials preferred to ignore. These mountain families spoke of a long history of unexplained disappearances in the region, particularly involving children, and warned that there were things living in the deepest parts of the mountains that most people preferred not to acknowledge. They described encounters with large, hair-covered creatures that moved through the forest with intelligence and purpose. Creatures that the Cherokee people had known about for centuries and had learned to avoid through careful adherence to traditional protocols that most modern visitors ignored. The search for Dennis Martin continued for 16 days, making it the longest and most extensive search operation in Great Smoky Mountains National Park history. Despite the massive effort, which covered over 500 square miles of rugged mountain terrain, no trace of the boy was ever found. No clothing, no personal items, no physical evidence that could provide closure to his family or answers to the investigators who had devoted weeks to finding him. The case was officially suspended on June 30th, though periodic searches continued for years afterward, whenever new information or potential sightings emerged. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of Dennis Martin's disappearance is the pattern it fits within the broader context of missing persons cases in the Appalachian Mountains. Research conducted years later revealed that the Great Smoky Mountains National Park has one of the highest rates of unexplained disappearances of any protected area in the United States, with a disproportionate number of cases involving children who vanish under circumstances that defy logical explanation. Many of these cases share common elements. Witnesses reporting unusual sounds or sightings in the area before the disappearance, search dogs behaving strangely or refusing to track, and a complete absence of physical evidence despite extensive search efforts. The Martin family never recovered from Dennis's disappearance. William Martin spent decades returning to the Great Smoky Mountains, conducting his own searches and following up on every possible lead. He became convinced that his son had been taken by something that lived in the deepest parts of the mountains, something that park officials were either unaware of or deliberately concealing. Before his death, William Martin stated publicly that he believed there were creatures in the Appalachian wilderness that were far more intelligent and dangerous than most people realized, and that Dennis had become a victim of forces that conventional search and rescue operations were not equipped to handle. The case of Dennis Martin remains officially unsolved, filed away in the archives of the National Park Service as a missing person case with no leads. But for those who understand the deeper patterns of disappearances in the Appalachian Mountains, Dennis's case represents something far more disturbing. Evidence that these ancient mountains harbor secrets that our modern world is not prepared to confront, and that sometimes, when we venture into the wilderness, we become part of mysteries that stretch back far longer than recorded history can account for. Let's move to our third story. On the evening of September 12th, 1952, a group of local boys in the small town of Flatwoods, West Virginia, witnessed what they believed to be a crashed meteor or aircraft on a nearby hillside, setting in motion a chain of events that would terrorize their community and create one of the most documented cryptid encounters in Appalachian history. What these boys discovered on that foggy autumn night was not wreckage from space, but something far more disturbing. A creature so alien and terrifying that it would haunt the residents of Braxton County for decades and establish the Flatwoods Monster as one of the most credible, unexplained encounters ever recorded in the American wilderness. The incident began at approximately 7:15 p.m. when brothers Edward and Fred May, ages 13 and 12 respectively, were playing football with their friends Tommy Heyer, Neil Nunley, and Ronnie Shaver in the schoolyard near their home in Flatwoods. The evening was typical for early fall in West Virginia. Cool, with a light fog beginning to settle in the valleys between the densely forested hills that surrounded their small community. The boys were engaged in their game when they noticed a bright red light streaking across the sky, moving in a controlled arc that suggested it was not a natural meteor, but something under intelligent guidance. The object appeared to be heading directly toward Fisher's Hill, a steep, wooded ridge that rose behind the local school and extended into the deep wilderness of the Appalachian backcountry. The boys watched in fascination as the red light descended behind the tree line, followed by what they described as a bright flash and a dull thudding sound that echoed through the valley. Their initial excitement at possibly witnessing a plane crash or meteor impact quickly gave way to curiosity and concern. If someone was hurt up on that hill, they might be the only people in a position to help. Edward May convinced his friends that they should investigate the crash site. But his mother, Kathleen May, insisted on accompanying them if they were going to venture into the dark woods. Mrs. May was a practical woman who understood the dangers of the Appalachian wilderness at night. But she was also concerned that there might indeed be injured people who needed assistance. She agreed to guide the expedition, bringing along a flashlight and enlisting the help of Eugene Lemon, a 17-year-old National Guardsman who was visiting the May household that evening. Lemon brought his dog, a large collie that was known for its courage and protective instincts. The group of 7, Mrs. May, her 2 sons, their 3 friends, and Eugene Lemon, began their climb up Fisher's Hill at approximately 7:30 p.m. The ascent was treacherous in the gathering darkness, with thick underbrush and steep terrain, making progress slow and difficult. The dog, normally eager to lead such expeditions, seemed increasingly agitated as they climbed higher, whimpering and staying close to the group in a way that suggested it sensed something wrong in the forest around them. About halfway up the hill, they began to notice a strange, acrid smell permeating the air. Something metallic and chemical that burned their nostrils and made their eyes water. As they approached the crest of the hill, the smell became almost overwhelming, and several members of the group began to feel nauseous and lightheaded. Mrs. May later described the odor as being similar to sulfur mixed with burning metal, but with an organic quality that suggested something biological and rotting. The fog had grown thicker during their climb, creating an eerie atmosphere where their flashlight beams seemed to be absorbed by the mist rather than illuminating their surroundings effectively. At approximately 8 p.m., Eugene Lemon's flashlight beam swept across a large oak tree near the summit of the hill and reflected off what he initially thought were the eyes of an animal caught in the light. But as the beam steadied and their vision adjusted, the group realized they were looking at something that defied every category of known wildlife. Perched in the lower branches of the oak tree was a creature that stood between 10 and 12 feet tall, with a dark, roughly humanoid shape that seemed to blend with the shadows around it. The creature's most striking feature was its head, which appeared disproportionately large and was crowned with what looked like a pointed hood or helmet that extended backward from its skull. Where a face should have been, there were two large, glowing red eyes that reflected their flashlight beam with an intensity that seemed almost like internal illumination. The eyes were not the simple reflection of animal eyes caught in light. They pulsed and flickered with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware of the human observers below. The creature's body was shrouded in what appeared to be a dark, flowing garment that hung from its shoulders like a cloak or robe. But the material seemed to move independently of any wind, rippling and shifting as if it were alive. Its arms were long and thin, extending well beyond what would be proportional for a human frame, and ended in what looked like clawed hands that gripped the tree branches with obvious strength. Most disturbing of all, the creature appeared to be floating rather than perched. It maintained its position in the tree without any visible means of support, hovering several feet above the strongest branches. As the group stood frozen in terror, staring up at this impossible sight, the creature began to emit a sound that would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. It was not quite a hiss and not quite a scream, but something between the two. A high-pitched, mechanical sound that seemed to come from multiple sources at once, as if the creature's voice were being electronically amplified or distorted. The sound was accompanied by a low, throbbing hum that they could feel in their chests as much as hear with their ears. The dog was the first to break from the paralysis that had gripped the group. With a yelp of pure terror, it turned and fled down the hillside, crashing through the underbrush in its desperate flight from whatever it had sensed or seen. The animal's panic broke the spell that had held the humans motionless, and Mrs. May began backing away from the tree, pulling her sons with her while keeping the flashlight trained on the creature above them. As they began their retreat, the creature moved for the first time, gliding rather than walking toward the edge of the tree's canopy. It seemed to be following their movement, tracking them with those terrible red eyes while maintaining its impossible hovering motion. The mechanical hissing sound grew louder and more agitated, and the chemical smell became so intense that several members of the group began to gag and struggle to breathe normally. Eugene Lemon later reported that, as they fled down the hillside, he looked back over his shoulder and saw the creature leave the tree entirely, floating through the air in pursuit of their group. He described it as moving like a giant bird or bat, but without any visible wings, simply gliding through the fog-shrouded forest with a fluid motion that defied gravity. The sight was so terrifying and impossible that Lemon questioned his own sanity even as he ran, wondering if the strange chemical smell had somehow affected his perception of reality. The group made it back to the May house in record time, bursting through the front door in a state of panic and terror that was immediately apparent to anyone who saw them. All 7 witnesses were pale, shaking, and struggling to breathe normally. Several of them began vomiting shortly after their return, and their symptoms persisted for hours afterward. Mrs. May called the local sheriff, Robert Carr, and within an hour, a small group of armed men had assembled to return to Fisher's Hill and investigate the group's claims. Sheriff Carr and his deputies, accompanied by several local residents, made the climb to the crash site that same night. They found no trace of the creature the group had described, but they did discover several disturbing pieces of evidence that supported parts of the witnesses' account. The area around the large oak tree showed signs of something heavy having been present. Broken branches, compressed undergrowth, and strange markings in the soil that didn't match any known animal tracks. Most significantly, the searchers confirmed the presence of the strange chemical odor that had affected the original group, though it was much fainter by the time they arrived. In the days following the encounter, investigators from various agencies descended on Flatwoods, including reporters, Air Force personnel, and civilian researchers interested in unexplained phenomena. The Air Force's official investigation concluded that the witnesses had likely seen a meteor combined with an owl perched in a tree, with panic and poor lighting conditions creating the illusion of something more exotic. However, this explanation failed to account for several key aspects of the encounter, including the chemical odor, the physical symptoms experienced by the witnesses, and the creature's apparent ability to move through the air without visible means of propulsion. Local residents were not satisfied with the official explanation, particularly because the Flatwoods encounter was not an isolated incident in the region. Throughout the 1950s, there had been numerous reports of similar creatures spotted in the forests and mountains of central West Virginia. Witnesses described encounters with tall, dark figures that seemed to glide rather than walk, often accompanied by the same chemical smell and similar physical symptoms in those who got too close. These reports came from credible sources: farmers, hunters, and outdoorsmen who had spent their entire lives in the Appalachian wilderness and knew the difference between normal wildlife and something genuinely anomalous. The physical symptoms experienced by the witnesses proved to be one of the most compelling aspects of the case. In the days following their encounter, all 7 members of the group continued to suffer from nausea, difficulty breathing, and irritation of their eyes and throats. When military doctors examined them, they found symptoms consistent with exposure to mustard gas or similar chemical agents. This finding was particularly disturbing because it suggested that whatever they had encountered was not simply a misidentified animal or atmospheric phenomenon, but something that had actually affected their physical health through exposure to unknown chemical compounds. Modern analysis of the Flatwoods monster encounter has only deepened the mystery rather than providing rational explanations. The consistency of the witnesses' accounts, the physical evidence found at the scene, and the documented health effects experienced by the group all point to an encounter with something genuinely unknown and potentially dangerous. The fact that similar sightings continued to occur in the region for years afterward suggests that the Flatwoods incident was not an isolated event, but part of a pattern of encounters with entities that remain beyond our current understanding of the natural world. The Flatwoods monster case represents one of the most thoroughly documented cryptid encounters in Appalachian history, with multiple credible witnesses, physical evidence, and lasting effects that extended far beyond the initial sighting. For the residents of Braxton County, the encounters served as a stark reminder that the ancient mountains and forests of West Virginia might harbor secrets that our modern world is not prepared to comprehend, and that sometimes, when we venture into the wilderness in search of answers, we discover questions that challenge everything we thought we knew about the nature of reality itself. Let's move to our 4th story. Geraldine Largay, known on the Appalachian Trail by her trail name Inchworm, was an experienced hiker with decades of outdoor experience when she set out from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, in July 2013 to complete a section hike of the Appalachian Trail through Maine. What began as a carefully planned adventure through some of the most beautiful wilderness in the eastern United States would end in one of the most heartbreaking and disturbing cases of survival and death ever documented in the Appalachian Mountains, revealing the terrifying reality of how quickly the ancient wilderness can swallow even the most prepared hikers without a trace. Geraldine was 66 years old when she began her Maine section hike, but age had not diminished her passion for the outdoors or her confidence in her abilities as a backpacker. She had been hiking seriously for over 30 years, completing numerous long-distance trails and multi-day wilderness expeditions with her husband George. The couple had already hiked significant portions of the Appalachian Trail together, and Geraldine's decision to tackle the Maine section solo was seen by friends and family as a natural progression of her hiking career rather than a risky endeavor. She was known for her meticulous planning, her attention to safety protocols, and her deep respect for the wilderness environments she loved to explore. The main section of the Appalachian Trail is considered one of the most challenging segments of the entire 2,190-mile footpath. Featuring rugged terrain, unpredictable weather, and long stretches between resupply points that test even experienced hikers' endurance and planning skills. Geraldine had studied the route extensively, mapping out her resupply points, identifying emergency exit strategies, and coordinating with her husband George, who would be driving parallel to the trail to meet her at predetermined road crossings. Their plan was thorough and conservative, designed to ensure that Geraldine would never be more than a few days away from contact with the outside world. On July 21st, 2013, Geraldine successfully reached the Poplar Ridge lean-to, where she spent the night according to her planned itinerary. She was making good time and feeling strong, documenting her progress in the detailed journal she kept throughout her hike. Her entries from this period reflect a hiker who was enjoying the challenge and beauty of the Maine wilderness, noting the abundant wildlife, the spectacular views from the ridgelines, and her satisfaction with her physical conditioning and gear choices. There was no indication in her writing that she was experiencing any difficulties or concerns about the trail ahead. The next morning, July 22nd, Geraldine left the Poplar Ridge lean-to, intending to hike approximately 8 miles to her next planned stop. The weather was clear and pleasant, with good visibility and comfortable temperatures that made for ideal hiking conditions. Her route would take her through a mix of forested valleys and ridgeline walking, terrain that she had successfully navigated many times before on previous hiking trips. According to her plan, she should have reached her next checkpoint by mid-afternoon, where George would be waiting to resupply her and check on her progress. Approximately 2 miles into her hike that morning, at a location that investigators would later identify as being just off the official Appalachian Trail corridor, Geraldine made a decision that would prove fatal. For reasons that remain unclear, she stepped off the marked trail, possibly to answer nature's call, or perhaps because she thought she was following a legitimate trail junction. The area where she left the main trail was later described by search and rescue teams as particularly confusing, with several unofficial paths and game trails that could easily be mistaken for the official route, especially by a hiker who was focused on the terrain ahead rather than carefully monitoring trail blazes. What happened next demonstrates how quickly an experienced hiker can become completely disoriented in the Appalachian wilderness. Instead of immediately recognizing her mistake and backtracking to the main trail, Geraldine appears to have continued walking, possibly believing that she was still on the correct route, or that she would soon intersect with the trail again. The dense forest canopy in this area made it difficult to use the sun for navigation, and the rolling terrain created a landscape where every direction looked similar, with no distinctive landmarks to provide reference points for reorientation. By the time Geraldine realized she was truly lost, she had wandered several miles from the Appalachian Trail into some of the most remote wilderness in Maine. She was now in an area with no marked trails, no established camping sites, and no regular human traffic that might provide opportunities for rescue. The terrain was challenging even for someone following established paths. Thick underbrush, steep ravines, and dense stands of conifers that limited visibility to just a few yards in any direction. When Geraldine failed to appear at her planned meeting point with George on July 22nd, he immediately contacted local authorities and initiated search protocols. George knew his wife's hiking habits intimately and understood that she would never deviate from their agreed-upon schedule without good reason. His prompt action in reporting her overdue probably gave Geraldine the best possible chance for rescue, as it meant that search teams were mobilized while she was still relatively close to her last known position and before weather conditions could deteriorate. The search operation that followed was massive and sophisticated, involving multiple agencies, specialized search and rescue teams, helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, and ground teams with trained search dogs. The searchers covered hundreds of square miles of rugged Maine wilderness, following every possible route that Geraldine might have taken and checking every shelter, trail junction, and water source in the region. The search continued for weeks, with volunteers and professional rescue personnel combing through some of the most inaccessible terrain in the state. What the searchers didn't know was that Geraldine was still alive during much of their search effort, but trapped in an area so remote and thickly forested that she could not hear their helicopters or see their searchlights, and they could not detect any sign of her presence. She had managed to find a small clearing near a seasonal water source, where she established a makeshift camp and began what would become a 26-day struggle for survival in the Maine wilderness. During her ordeal, Geraldine maintained the detailed journal that would later provide investigators with a heartbreaking day-by-day account of her survival efforts and her gradual decline. Her early entries reveal a hiker who was still optimistic about her chances for rescue, rationing her limited food supplies and constructing shelter while expecting that search teams would locate her within a few days. She documented her attempts to signal for help, including using her whistle, creating visible markers in clearings, and trying to reach higher ground where she might have better cell phone reception. As days turned into weeks, Geraldine's journal entries began to reflect the harsh reality of her situation. Her food ran out after just a few days, forcing her to forage for berries and attempt to catch small fish from the stream near her camp. The Maine wilderness in summer provided some edible plants, but not nearly enough calories to sustain an adult human for an extended period. Her physical condition began to deteriorate rapidly as she burned through her body's fat and muscle reserves while struggling to maintain her core temperature during cold mountain nights. Geraldine's journal reveals that she never gave up hope for rescue, continuing to write detailed entries that expressed her love for her family and her determination to survive until help arrived. She documented her daily routine of searching for food, maintaining her shelter, and attempting to signal for help. Her entries also reveal a deep spiritual faith that sustained her through the most difficult periods of her ordeal. As she found comfort in prayer and meditation, even as her physical situation became increasingly desperate. On August 18th, 27 days after she had become lost, Geraldine wrote her final journal entry. By this point, she was severely weakened by starvation and exposure. But her writing remained coherent and reflected her continued love for her family and her acceptance of her situation. She expressed no anger or bitterness about her circumstances, instead focusing on gratitude for the life she had lived and the experiences she had enjoyed. Her final words were a message of love to her husband and daughter, asking them not to blame themselves for her death and to remember the joy she had found in exploring the wilderness. The massive search operation was officially suspended in late August 2013, after covering over 1,000 square miles of Maine wilderness without finding any trace of Geraldine or her equipment. The case was reclassified as a missing person investigation, and periodic searches continued whenever new information or potential sightings were reported. For 2 years, the mystery of what had happened to Inchworm remained unsolved, leaving her family without closure and the hiking community to speculate about how an experienced backpacker could simply vanish in terrain that had been thoroughly searched by professional rescue teams. The answer came in October 2015, when a surveyor working in a remote section of forest approximately 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail discovered the remains of Geraldine's campsite and her body. The location was so isolated and thickly forested that it had been missed during the intensive search efforts, despite multiple teams passing within a few hundred yards of her position. The discovery site revealed the full extent of Geraldine's survival efforts. she had constructed an effective shelter, organized her remaining gear efficiently, and maintained her campsite for the entire duration of her ordeal. Most significantly, investigators recovered Geraldine's journal, which provided a complete record of her 26 days in the wilderness and revealed the heartbreaking reality of her slow death from starvation and exposure. The journal entries showed that she had survived far longer than most people could have managed in similar circumstances, demonstrating remarkable resilience and wilderness skills even as her situation became hopeless. Her final entries revealed that she had been aware that rescue was unlikely at that point, but had continued to maintain hope and document her experience for the benefit of her family and future investigators. The discovery of Geraldine Larguet's remains and journal sent shockwaves through the Appalachian hiking community and raised disturbing questions about the effectiveness of search and rescue operations in the dense wilderness areas of the trail. Here was an experienced hiker who had become lost just miles from a heavily traveled trail, in an area that had been extensively searched by professional teams, yet had remained undiscovered for over 2 years. Her case highlighted the terrifying reality that even the most prepared and experienced hikers can disappear completely in the Appalachian wilderness, and that survival skills and determination are sometimes not enough to overcome the harsh indifference of the ancient mountains. The tragedy of Geraldine Larguet serves as a sobering reminder that the Appalachian Mountains, for all their beauty and recreational opportunities, remain genuinely wild places where human life can be extinguished with terrifying efficiency. Her story demonstrates that experience, preparation, and caution are not always sufficient protection against the fundamental dangers of wilderness travel, and that the same forests that provide spiritual renewal and physical challenge can also serve as unmarked graves for those who make even small mistakes in navigation or judgment. Let's move to our 5th story. In the early morning hours of August 28, 1826, the White Mountains of New Hampshire were battered by one of the most violent storms in the region's recorded history, with torrential rains and hurricane-force winds that transformed peaceful mountain streams into raging torrents capable of moving boulders and uprooting centuries-old trees. When the storm finally passed and rescuers made their way up the treacherous mountain roads to check on isolated families, they discovered one of the most perplexing and disturbing mysteries in Appalachian history: the complete disappearance of the Willey family from their home in Crawford Notch, despite the fact that their house remained virtually untouched by the devastating forces that had reshaped the landscape around it. The Willey family had been living in Crawford Notch for several years, operating a small inn and way station for travelers crossing through the White Mountains between New Hampshire and Maine. Samuel Willey, the family patriarch, had moved his wife Polly and their 5 children, Elva, Jeremiah, Martha, Elbridge, and Sally, to this remote location because he saw an opportunity to provide services to the increasing number of settlers, merchants, and adventurers who were beginning to traverse the mountain passes as New England expanded westward. The location was both strategic and dangerous, situated directly in the path of avalanches and rock slides that regularly swept down from the steep mountainsides. But Samuel believed that the economic opportunities outweighed the risks. The Willey house was built in a small clearing at the base of Mount Willey, positioned to take advantage of the natural route through Crawford Notch while providing some protection from the worst weather that regularly swept through the mountain passes. Samuel had constructed his home and outbuildings with an understanding of the mountain environment, using heavy timber construction and positioning the structures to deflect prevailing winds and channel water away from the foundation during the spring melts and summer storms that were common in the region. Living with the Willey family were 2 hired men who helped with the inn operations and the physical labor required to maintain buildings and clear roadways in the challenging mountain environment. David Nickerson and David Allen were experienced woodsmen who had worked for Samuel for over a year and were familiar with both the daily routines of the household and the particular dangers posed by the mountain location. Also present in the house that night were two guests who had been traveling through the Notch and had taken shelter at the Willie Inn to wait out the storm. Circumstances that would make their disappearance even more inexplicable. The storm that struck the White Mountains on the night of August 28th was unprecedented in its violence and duration. Witnesses from nearby settlements described winds that sounded like freight, trains roaring through the mountain passes, accompanied by rainfall so heavy that it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The combination of wind and water transformed the normally manageable mountain streams into torrents that carved new channels through the landscape, while landslides and rockfalls blocked established roads and trails throughout the region. Local residents who had lived in the White Mountains for decades later said that they had never experienced weather of such destructive power. The storm seemed to focus its fury on the higher elevations, where the Willie family was located, creating conditions that made travel impossible and communication with the outside world completely cut off. Trees that had stood for centuries were uprooted and hurled down mountainsides like matchsticks, while boulders the size of houses were dislodged from their ancient resting places and sent tumbling into valleys below. When the storm finally exhausted itself in the early morning hours of August 29th, rescue parties from nearby settlements began the dangerous work of checking on isolated families and clearing blocked roadways. The journey to Crawford Notch was particularly treacherous, as the storm had fundamentally altered the landscape, creating new obstacles and eliminating familiar landmarks that travelers had relied upon for navigation. It took rescue teams most of the day to reach the area where the Willie house was located, and what they found defied every expectation and logical explanation. The Willie house stood intact and apparently undamaged, with its windows unbroken, its roof secure, and its doors still properly latched. The building showed no signs of having been damaged by the storm's fury, despite clear evidence all around it that the area had been subjected to forces capable of destroying much more substantial structures. Trees had been uprooted within yards of the house, and a massive landslide had swept down the mountainside, missing the building by mere feet before continuing into the valley below. But when the rescuers entered the house, they found it completely empty. All 9 people who had been sheltering there during the storm, Samuel and Polly Willie, their 5 children, the 2 hired men, and the 2 guests, had vanished without a trace. Their personal belongings remained undisturbed, meals were still on the table as if interrupted mid-bite, and beds showed signs of having been slept in, but were now vacant. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, and no indication that the occupants had packed any belongings or prepared for departure. The most disturbing aspect of the discovery was the evidence that the family had been present in the house during at least part of the storm. Candles had been lit and were found burned down to stubs, suggesting that the family had been awake and active during the night. A fire had been built in the main hearth and had burned down to cold ashes, indicating that someone had been tending it hours earlier. Most significantly, there were signs that food had been prepared and partially consumed sometime during the night, as if the family had been going about their normal routines even as the storm raged outside. Search teams immediately began combing the surrounding forest and mountainsides, looking for any sign of the missing family members. They found clear evidence of the landslide that had swept past the house, creating a path of destruction that extended for miles down into the valley. The slide had been massive, moving thousands of tons of rock, soil, and vegetation with such force that it had carved a new channel through the landscape and dammed several streams, creating temporary lakes that had not existed before the storm. Within this path of destruction, searchers made a horrifying discovery that only deepened the mystery. They found the bodies of two members of the Willie family, Samuel and one of his children, buried under tons of debris approximately half a mile from the house. The bodies were positioned in a way that suggested they had been caught in the open when the landslide struck. But this raised the question of why they had left the safety of their intact house to venture into the deadly storm. More disturbing still was the fact that only two bodies were recovered, despite extensive searching that continued for weeks. The remaining 7 people who had been in the house that night were never found, despite the fact that the landslide path had been thoroughly excavated, and every possible location where bodies might have been buried was carefully examined. It was as if 5 members of the Willie family and the 2 hired men had simply vanished from existence, leaving no trace of their fate or any clue about what had motivated them to leave their shelter during the height of the storm. The partial remains that were recovered provided some clues, but raised even more questions. The bodies of Samuel Willie and his child showed no signs of injury that would have occurred before the landslide struck them. They had not been beaten, stabbed, shot, or harmed in any way that suggested violence or struggle. Their positioning suggested that they had been running or walking when the slide overtook them. But there was no evidence of what they might have been running from or toward in the midst of the deadly storm. Local authorities conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing everyone who had known the Willie family and examining every piece of evidence found at the scene. They discovered that Samuel had been concerned about the possibility of landslides and had actually prepared an emergency evacuation plan for his family in case the mountainside became unstable. According to neighbors, Samuel had identified a large boulder some distance from the house that he believed would provide shelter if they needed to flee a slide, and he had discussed this plan with his family on several occasions. This information led investigators to theorize that Samuel might have heard or sensed the approaching landslide and ordered his family to evacuate the house according to their emergency plan. However, this theory failed to explain several critical aspects of the case. If the family had evacuated together, why were only 2 bodies found? If they had fled in panic, why did the house show no signs of hasty departure? And most puzzling of all, why had they not taken any supplies, warm clothing, or other necessities that would have been essential for survival in the post-storm environment? The investigation also revealed disturbing inconsistencies in the timeline of events. Based on the evidence found in the house, it appeared that the family had been present and active well into the night, long after the landslide had occurred. The burned-down candles, cold ashes in the fireplace, and partially consumed food all suggested that people had been living normally in the house for hours after the time when Samuel and his child had been killed in the slide. This meant that either the family had evacuated in waves over several hours, or something else entirely had happened that the physical evidence could not explain. Local Native American tribes had their own interpretation of the Willie family tragedy, one that reflected their deep understanding of the spiritual forces they believed inhabited the White Mountains. Tribal elders spoke of the mountains as living entities that demanded respect and could become vengeful when their ancient equilibrium was disturbed. They suggested that the Willie family had somehow offended the mountain spirits and had been claimed as payment for their transgression, with their disappearance serving as a warning to others who might challenge the power of the ancient peaks. The mystery of the Willie family disappearance became a source of fascination and horror throughout New England, inspiring numerous investigations, theories, and artistic works over the decades that followed. Writers and journalists visited the site repeatedly, interviewing local residents and examining the physical evidence in hopes of solving the puzzle. However, despite all these efforts, no definitive explanation for the family's fate was ever established, and the case remains one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in the history of the White Mountains. The Willie house itself became a morbid tourist attraction, with visitors coming from throughout New England to see the structure that had survived a storm capable of moving mountains, while its occupants vanished without explanation. The building stood empty for years after the tragedy, as local residents were reluctant to occupy a place associated with such an inexplicable and disturbing event. Eventually, the house was torn down, but the mystery of what happened to the Willie family continued to haunt the collective memory of the region. Modern investigators who have studied the case using contemporary forensic techniques and historical analysis have been unable to provide a satisfactory explanation for the family's disappearance. The physical evidence remains consistent with the original findings: a house that showed no signs of violence or forced departure, 2 bodies found in a landslide path, and 7 people who vanished completely without leaving any trace of their fate. Some researchers have theorized that the missing family members might have fallen into hidden crevasses or underground caverns that were opened by the storm, but extensive ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area have failed to locate any remains. The Willie family tragedy represents one of the most disturbing examples of how the Appalachian Mountains can claim human lives in ways that defy understanding or explanation. The case demonstrates that even when people take reasonable precautions and follow logical emergency plans, the ancient forces that shape these mountains can intervene in ways that transcend human comprehension. For the residents of the White Mountains, the Willie disappearance serves as a permanent reminder that they live in a landscape where the normal rules of cause and effect sometimes fail to apply, and where families can be erased from existence as completely as if they had never lived at all. Let's move to our 6th story. In the remote mountain valleys of Vermont and Virginia, sections of the Appalachian Trail that should represent the pinnacle of American wilderness hiking have become hunting grounds for one of the most dangerous religious cults operating in the United States today. The 12 Tribes, a fundamentalist Christian sect founded in the 1970s, has established a network of hostels, restaurants, and businesses along strategic portions of the trail, using these seemingly innocent operations as recruitment centers to prey upon vulnerable hikers who are seeking spiritual meaning in the wilderness. What appears to outsiders as harmless hospitality has been revealed through decades of disturbing encounters to be a sophisticated system of psychological manipulation designed to separate hikers from their families, their identities, and ultimately, their freedom. The 12 Tribes cult was founded in 1972 by Gene Spriggs, a former carnival worker and self-proclaimed prophet who established the group's headquarters in Island Pond, Vermont, deep in the heart of the Green Mountains. Spriggs, who took the name Yonek within the organization, developed a theology that combined elements of fundamentalist Christianity with his own interpretations of biblical prophecy and apocalyptic beliefs. The group's doctrine required members to live in communal arrangements, surrender all personal property to the collective, and submit completely to the authority of male elders who claimed direct communication with God. From its earliest days, the 12 Tribes demonstrated a disturbing pattern of targeting individuals who were in transitional or vulnerable states in their lives. College students questioning their faith, young adults struggling with family relationships, and people experiencing personal crises were particularly susceptible to the group's recruitment tactics. The cult's leaders quickly recognized that long-distance hikers represented an ideal demographic for recruitment. They were often young, spiritually seeking, physically and emotionally exhausted from weeks in the wilderness, and temporarily separated from their normal support networks. By the early 1980s, the 12 Tribes had established their first trail-adjacent operations, including the famous Yellow Deli in Rutland, Vermont, which became a popular stop for Appalachian trail hikers seeking a break from trail food and a chance to resupply in town. The restaurant appeared to be exactly what weary hikers needed: clean, welcoming, staffed by friendly young people who seemed genuinely interested in their trail experiences. and offering generous portions of high-quality food at reasonable prices. What hikers didn't initially realize was that every interaction was carefully orchestrated to identify potential recruits and begin the subtle process of psychological manipulation that the cult had refined over decades of operation. The Yellow Deli and similar 12 Tribes establishments along the trail employed a recruitment strategy that exploited the unique psychological state of long-distance hikers. After weeks or months in the wilderness, hikers often experienced a phenomenon known as trail euphoria, a heightened emotional state characterized by increased openness to new experiences, reduced critical thinking abilities, and a sense of spiritual seeking that made them particularly vulnerable to manipulation. The cult's recruiters were trained to recognize these signs and to present their community as the answer to whatever spiritual or emotional needs the hikers were experiencing. Former cult members who have escaped and spoken publicly about their experiences describe a recruitment process that began with seemingly innocent conversations about the hikers' trail experience, their reasons for undertaking long-distance hiking, and their spiritual beliefs. The cult members working in these establishments were skilled at identifying hikers who expressed dissatisfaction with their previous lives, uncertainty about their future plans, or interest in alternative spiritual communities. These hikers would be invited to stay overnight at cult-operated hostels, where the recruitment process would intensify through sleep deprivation, continuous religious discussions, and social pressure from multiple cult members. The cult's hostile operations along the trail became particularly notorious among experienced hikers who learned to recognize the warning signs and avoid these establishments. The hostels were typically located in remote areas where hikers had limited alternative accommodations, making it difficult for them to leave once they realized the true nature of their hosts. Former guests describe being subjected to hours-long religious lectures, having their personal belongings searched while they slept, and being pressured to participate in group activities that were designed to break down individual resistance and promote dependence on the group. One of the most disturbing aspects of the 12 Tribes trail operations was their systematic targeting of hikers who were hiking alone or who appeared to have limited connections to family and friends back home. Solo hikers, particularly young women, were considered prime recruitment targets because they were less likely to have immediate support networks that would notice their disappearance or intervene in the recruitment process. The cult developed detailed profiles of successful recruitment targets, focusing on individuals who had expressed alienation from their families, dissatisfaction with conventional career paths, or interest in communal living arrangements. Multiple documented cases exist of hikers who stayed at 12 Tribes hostels and were never seen again by their families or friends. In some instances, these hikers sent final messages to loved ones explaining that they had found a new spiritual community and would not be returning to their previous lives. In other cases, hikers simply vanished without any communication, leaving families to wonder whether their loved ones had been victims of accidents, violence, or voluntary recruitment into an organization they had never heard of. The cult's recruitment tactics became so notorious within the hiking community that informal warning networks developed among trail angels, hostel operators, and experienced hikers who worked to alert newcomers about the dangers posed by 12 Tribes operations. These warnings were often shared through trail registers, online hiking forums, and word-of-mouth communication among hikers. But the cult's sophisticated approach meant that many hikers were successfully recruited despite these efforts to raise awareness. Investigation into the 12 Tribes trail operations revealed that the cult had developed detailed intelligence-gathering operations focused on the hiking community. They monitored online hiking forums, maintained databases of information about individual hikers, and coordinated their recruitment efforts across multiple trail locations to maximize their chances of success. Former cult members reported that the organization maintained detailed files on potential recruits, including information about their family backgrounds, financial situations, psychological vulnerabilities, and hiking histories. The cult's approach to recruited hikers was particularly insidious because it exploited the genuine sense of community and spiritual connection that many people seek through long-distance hiking. New recruits were initially treated as honored guests and were encouraged to share their trail experiences with the group. They were provided with comfortable accommodations, abundant food, and constant attention from cult members who seemed genuinely interested in their stories and experiences. This love-bombing phase was designed to create strong emotional bonds between recruits and the group, before gradually introducing more restrictive elements of cult life. Once hikers were successfully recruited, they were typically isolated from their former lives through a process that began gradually but eventually became complete. New members were encouraged to break contact with family and friends who might question their decision to join the group. They were required to surrender all personal possessions and financial assets to the cult, leaving them financially dependent on the organization. Most disturbing of all, they were subjected to increasingly intensive indoctrination that was designed to break down their individual identities and replace them with complete loyalty to the cult's leadership. The physical locations of 12 tribes' operations along the Appalachian Trail were carefully chosen to maximize their recruitment potential, while minimizing outside scrutiny. Many of their facilities were located in remote mountain communities, where local law enforcement had limited resources and experience dealing with cult activities. The cult cultivated relationships with local officials and business owners, presenting themselves as beneficial members of the community who brought tourist dollars and helped maintain local traditions. Former law enforcement officials who investigated 12 tribes' operations described a sophisticated organization that was skilled at operating within legal boundaries while engaging in practices that were clearly harmful to their members. The cult's lawyers and public relations specialists worked to maintain a positive public image while deflecting criticism and avoiding government intervention. They developed extensive media strategies designed to portray critics as religious bigots and to present the cult's practices as legitimate expressions of religious freedom. The impact of 12 tribes' recruitment on families whose loved ones disappeared into the cult cannot be overstated. Parents, siblings, and spouses were left with no information about the fate of hikers who had simply vanished into the cult's operations. Legal efforts to locate and communicate with cult members were often unsuccessful due to the organization's policy of complete isolation from outside contacts. Families reported spending thousands of dollars on private investigators and legal fees in unsuccessful attempts to locate missing relatives. Mental health professionals who have studied the 12 tribes' recruitment methods describe them as classic examples of thought reform and psychological manipulation. The cult's techniques included sleep deprivation, nutritional manipulation, constant surveillance, and social pressure that was designed to break down individual resistance and promote complete dependence on the group. Former members describe experiencing symptoms consistent with complex trauma, including depression, anxiety, difficulty forming relationships, and struggles with identity and self-worth that persisted long after their escape from the cult. The most tragic aspect of the 12 tribes' Appalachian Trail operations is that they represent a betrayal of everything the trail community values: independence, mutual support, respect for individual choice, and connection with the natural world. The cult's sophisticated exploitation of hiking culture demonstrates how predatory organizations can infiltrate and corrupt even the most positive and life-affirming communities. For families whose loved ones have disappeared into 12 tribes operations, the Appalachian Trail has become not a source of healing and adventure, but a symbol of loss and unanswered questions. Modern efforts to combat the 12 tribes' trail recruitment have focused on education and awareness raising within the hiking community. Trail organizations, guidebook authors, and online resources now routinely include warnings about cult recruitment tactics and specific information about organizations to avoid. However, The cult continues to operate trail-adjacent businesses and continues to recruit vulnerable hikers, suggesting that the threat they pose to the hiking community remains active and ongoing. The 12 tribes' presence along the Appalachian Trail serves as a disturbing reminder that even in the seeming safety of America's most famous hiking route, predators are waiting to exploit the trust and vulnerability that are essential elements of trail culture. Their sophisticated recruitment operations demonstrate that the ancient mountains that shelter the trail can conceal modern forms of evil that are just as dangerous as any natural hazard hikers might encounter in the wilderness. Let's move to our 7th story. Between November 1966 and December 1967, the small industrial town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, nestled along the Ohio River in the heart of Appalachian coal country, became the epicenter of one of the most well-documented and terrifying cryptid encounters in American history. What began as isolated sightings of a massive, winged creature with glowing red eyes escalated into a 13-month reign of terror that culminated in one of the deadliest bridge collapses in United States history, forever linking the mysterious entity known as the Mothman to a tragedy that claimed 46 lives and left a community questioning everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. Point Pleasant in 1966 was a typical Appalachian river town, built around heavy industry and sustained by the coal mining operations that had dominated the regional economy for over a century. The town's population of approximately 6,000 residents was largely composed of working-class families whose lives revolved around the chemical plants, coal processing facilities, and transportation infrastructure that lined the Ohio River. Most residents had deep generational roots in the area, with families that had lived in the Appalachian foothills for generations and possessed an intimate knowledge of the local wildlife, weather patterns, and natural phenomena that characterized their environment. The first recorded encounter with the creature that would become known as the Mothman occurred on November 12, 1966, when 5 men working in a cemetery near Clendenin, West Virginia, approximately 20 miles from Point Pleasant, reported seeing a large, winged figure rise from the trees and fly directly overhead. The witnesses described the creature as being roughly human in shape, but much larger, with a wingspan that appeared to exceed 10 feet and the ability to fly without any visible means of propulsion. Most disturbing of all, the creature appeared to be watching them deliberately, circling overhead for several minutes before disappearing into the darkness. 3 days later, on November 15th, the Mothman made its most famous appearance in an encounter that would establish the parameters for all subsequent sightings and demonstrate the creature's apparently supernatural abilities. 2 young couples, Reverenders Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallett, were driving through the abandoned West Virginia Ordnance Works, a sprawling complex of deteriorating military buildings and chemical storage facilities that had been used for munitions production during World War II. The area, known locally as the TNT area, had been largely abandoned since the war's end, but remained a popular destination for young people seeking privacy and adventure. At approximately 11:30 p.m., as the couples drove slowly through the industrial ruins, their headlights illuminated what they initially thought was a large animal standing near an abandoned power plant. But as their vision adjusted and they got a clearer view of what was ahead of them, they realized they were looking at something that defied every category of known wildlife. The creature stood between 6 and 7 feet tall when upright, but its most striking features were its enormous wings, which appeared to be folded against its body, and its eyes, 2 large, hypnotic red orbs that seemed to glow with their own internal light. As the terrified couples watched, the creature unfolded its wings to reveal a wingspan that they estimated at between 10 and 15 feet. The wings appeared to be membranous, similar to those of a bat, but much larger and more substantial than any natural creature could possess. Most unnervingly, the creature seemed to be watching them with obvious intelligence, tilting its head in a way that suggested curiosity rather than simple animal awareness. When Roger Scarberry accelerated the car and attempted to leave the area, the creature took flight and began pursuing their vehicle with a speed and agility that should have been impossible for any known flying animal. The pursuit that followed would become one of the most documented aspects of the Mothman phenomenon and would establish the creature's reputation for supernatural speed and persistence. As the car reached speeds of over 100 miles per hour on the winding country roads leading back to Point Pleasant, the creature not only kept pace, but appeared to be flying effortlessly alongside and above the vehicle. The witnesses reported that the Mothman never appeared to flap its wings during the pursuit, instead gliding through the air with a fluid motion that suggested some form of propulsion that didn't conform to the normal laws of aerodynamics. Most disturbing of all, the creature seemed to anticipate the car's movements, taking shortcuts through the air that allowed it to stay ahead of the vehicle, even when the driver changed direction or attempted evasive maneuvers. The pursuit continued for several miles, with the creature maintaining its position relative to the car regardless of speed or direction changes. The witnesses reported that the creature's red eyes remained fixed on them throughout the encounter, creating an overwhelming sense that they were being studied rather than simply chased. When the couples finally reached the town limits of Point Pleasant, the creature broke off its pursuit and disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind 4 badly shaken witnesses who struggled to make sense of what they had experienced. Their decision to report the encounter to local law enforcement would prove to be a turning point in the town's history, as it marked the beginning of a wave of sightings that would continue for over a year and transform Point Pleasant into a destination for investigators, reporters, and curiosity seekers from around the world. Sheriff George Johnson, who took the initial report from the 2 couples, was initially skeptical of their claims, but was impressed by their obvious sincerity and the consistency of their accounts. Johnson knew all 4 witnesses personally and considered them to be reliable, level-headed individuals who were not prone to exaggeration or attention-seeking behavior. When he accompanied them back to the TNT area later that night to investigate the site of their encounter, Johnson discovered physical evidence that supported their story. Large, unidentifiable tracks in the soft earth near the power plant and broken tree branches at a height that suggested something very large had recently passed through the area. The publicity surrounding the Scarberry-Millette encounter triggered a flood of similar reports from throughout the Point Pleasant area, as residents who had been reluctant to discuss their own strange experiences came forward with accounts of encounters that had occurred weeks or months earlier. Many of these reports shared common elements with the initial sighting: descriptions of a large, winged creature with glowing red eyes that demonstrated obvious intelligence and supernatural abilities. Witnesses consistently reported that the creature seemed to be studying human activity rather than simply moving through its environment, and that it possessed the ability to appear and disappear in ways that suggested supernatural rather than natural origins. The TNT area became the focal point for most Mothman sightings, leading investigators to speculate about possible connections between the creature's presence and the abandoned military facility. The area contained numerous abandoned buildings, underground tunnels, and chemical storage sites that had been used for munitions production during World War II. Environmental testing conducted years later would reveal significant contamination from various chemical compounds, leading some researchers to theorize that the Mothman might be a mutated animal created by exposure to military chemicals. However, this theory failed to account for the creature's apparent supernatural abilities and high level of intelligence. As reports of Mothman encounters continued to accumulate throughout 1967, A pattern began to emerge that suggested the creature was not simply a random anomaly, but part of a larger phenomenon affecting the entire Point Pleasant area. Witnesses reported unusual electromagnetic disturbances in the vicinity of Mothman sightings, including television and radio interference, telephone malfunctions, and car engines that stalled or failed to start. These effects were not limited to the immediate vicinity of sightings, but seemed to affect electronic equipment throughout the town during periods of high Mothman activity. Even more disturbing were reports of prophetic dreams and visions experienced by witnesses who had encountered the Mothman. Multiple individuals reported having vivid nightmares about disasters and catastrophes in the weeks following their sightings, dreams that were often accompanied by images of the red-eyed creature watching from a distance. Some witnesses reported receiving telepathic messages that they believed originated from the Mothman, messages that often contained warnings about future events or cryptic references to danger facing the community. The most famous of these prophetic experiences was reported by Connie Carpenter, a Point Pleasant resident who claimed to have had repeated encounters with the Mothman throughout 1967. Carpenter reported that the creature had been attempting to communicate with her telepathically, sending messages that she interpreted as warnings about an impending disaster that would affect the entire community. According to Carpenter, the Mothman's messages became increasingly urgent and specific as 1967 progressed, culminating in visions of a catastrophic bridge collapse that would occur during the Christmas season. Carpenter's warnings were largely dismissed by local authorities and most residents, who viewed her claims as the fantasies of someone seeking attention or struggling with mental health issues. However, her predictions would take on a horrifying significance on December 15, 1967, when the Silver Bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, catastrophically collapsed during evening rush hour traffic. The bridge, which had been a vital transportation link for the community since 1928, failed without warning, sending 46 vehicles and their occupants plunging into the icy waters of the Ohio River below. The Silver Bridge collapse was one of the deadliest infrastructure failures in American history, claiming 46 lives and traumatizing the Point Pleasant community in ways that continue to affect residents today. The official investigation determined that the collapse was caused by the failure of a single eye-bar in the bridge's suspension system, a failure that created a chain reaction that brought down the entire structure in less than a minute. However, the timing of the collapse, coming at the height of the Mothman phenomenon and just weeks after Connie Carpenter's specific warnings about a bridge disaster, convinced many residents that the creature had been trying to warn them about the impending tragedy. In the immediate aftermath of the Silver Bridge collapse, Mothman sightings in the Point Pleasant area dropped dramatically, leading to speculation that the creature's presence had been somehow connected to the impending disaster. Some investigators theorized that the Mothman was a harbinger of doom, appearing in areas where catastrophic events were about to occur. Others suggested that the creature might have been trying to prevent the disaster by warning susceptible individuals like Connie Carpenter, but had been unable to communicate its message effectively enough to prevent the tragedy. The connection between the Mothman and the Silver Bridge collapse was popularized by journalist John Keel, whose 1975 book, The Mothman Prophecies, documented the entire 13-month period of sightings and established the creature as one of America's most famous cryptids. Keel's investigation revealed patterns in the Mothman encounters that suggested the creature possessed not only supernatural abilities, but also some form of precognitive knowledge about future events. His work demonstrated that many witnesses had reported prophetic dreams and visions that later proved to be accurate, though often in ways that were too cryptic to be useful for preventing the predicted disasters. Modern investigators who have studied the Mothman phenomenon using contemporary research methods have been unable to provide definitive explanations for the encounters that occurred in Point Pleasant between 1966 and 1967. The consistency of witness accounts, the physical evidence found at sighting locations, and the documented electromagnetic effects associated with the creature's presence all point to an encounter with something genuinely anomalous rather than misidentification of known animals or psychological phenomena. The legacy of the Mothman continues to influence Point Pleasant today, with the town embracing its connection to the creature through festivals, statues, and tourism promotions that draw thousands of visitors annually. However, for older residents who lived through the original encounters and the Silver Bridge collapse, the Mothman remains a source of genuine unease and continued mystery. Many residents report ongoing sightings of the creature, though these encounters are typically much briefer and less dramatic than the original 1966 to 1967 wave. The Mothman of Point Pleasant represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of how the Appalachian Mountains can serve as a stage for encounters with forces that exist beyond our current understanding of the natural world. The creature's apparent ability to predict future disasters, its supernatural physical capabilities, and its obvious intelligence suggest that the ancient mountains and valleys of West Virginia may be home to entities that operate according to laws of physics and consciousness that science has yet to comprehend. For the residents of Point Pleasant, the Mothman serves as a permanent reminder that their community sits at the intersection of the known and unknown worlds, where the familiar landscape of coal mines and river valleys can suddenly become the domain of creatures that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of reality itself. Let's move to our seventh story. Between November 1966 and December 1967, the small industrial town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, nestled along the Ohio River in the heart of Appalachian coal country, became the epicenter of one of the most well-documented and terrifying cryptid encounters in American history. What began as isolated sightings of a massive, winged creature with glowing red eyes escalated into a 13-month reign of terror that culminated in one of the deadliest bridge collapses in United States history, forever linking the mysterious entity known as the Mothman to a tragedy that claimed 46 lives and left a community questioning everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. Point Pleasant in 1966 was a typical Appalachian river town, built around heavy industry and sustained by the coal mining operations that had dominated the regional economy for over a century. The town's population of approximately 6,000 residents was largely composed of working-class families whose lives revolved around the chemical plants, coal processing facilities, and transportation infrastructure that lined the Ohio River. Most residents had deep generational roots in the area, with families that had lived in the Appalachian foothills for generations and possessed an intimate knowledge of the local wildlife, weather patterns, and natural phenomena that characterized their environment. The first recorded encounter with a creature that would become known as the Mothman occurred on November 12, 1966, when 5 men working in a cemetery near Clendon in West Virginia, approximately 20 miles from Point Pleasant, reported seeing a large, winged figure rise from the trees and fly directly overhead. The witnesses described the creature as being roughly human in shape, but much larger, with a wingspan that appeared to exceed 10 feet and the ability to fly without any visible means of propulsion. Most disturbing of all, the creature appeared to be watching them deliberately, circling overhead for several minutes before disappearing into the darkness. 3 days later, on November 15th, the Mothman made its most famous appearance in an encounter that would establish the parameters for all subsequent sightings and demonstrate the creature's apparently supernatural abilities. 2 young couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, and Steve and Mary Mallette, were driving through the abandoned West Virginia Ordnance Works, a sprawling complex of deteriorating military buildings and chemical storage facilities that had been used for munitions production during World War II. The area, known locally as the TNT area, had been largely abandoned since the war's end, but remained a popular destination for young people seeking privacy and adventure. At approximately 11:30 p.m., as the couples drove slowly through the industrial ruins, their headlights illuminated what they initially thought was a large animal standing near an abandoned power plant. But as their vision adjusted and they got a clearer view of what was ahead of them, they realized they were looking at something that defied every category of known wildlife. The creature stood between 6 and 7 feet tall when upright, but its most striking features were its enormous wings, which appeared to be folded against its body and its eyes. Two large, hypnotic red orbs that seemed to glow with their own internal light. As the terrified couples watched, the creature unfolded its wings to reveal a wingspan that they estimated at between 10 and 15 feet. The wings appeared to be membranous, similar to those of a bat, but much larger and more substantial than any natural creature could possess. Most unnervingly, the creature seemed to be watching them with obvious intelligence, tilting its head in a way that suggested curiosity rather than simple animal awareness. When Roger Scarberry accelerated the car and attempted to leave the area, the creature took flight and began pursuing their vehicle with a speed and agility that should have been impossible for any known flying animal. The pursuit that followed would become one of the most documented aspects of the Mothman phenomenon and would establish the creature's reputation for supernatural speed and persistence. As the car reached speeds of over 100 miles per hour on the winding country roads leading back to Point Pleasant, the creature not only kept pace, but appeared to be flying effortlessly alongside and above the vehicle. The witnesses reported that the Mothman never appeared to flap its wings during the pursuit, instead gliding through the air with a fluid motion that suggested some form of propulsion that didn't conform to the normal laws of aerodynamics. Most disturbing of all, the creature seemed to anticipate the car's movements, taking shortcuts through the air that allowed it to stay ahead of the vehicle, even when the driver changed direction or attempted evasive maneuvers. The pursuit continued for several miles, with the creature maintaining its position relative to the car regardless of speed or direction changes. The witnesses reported that the creature's red eyes remained fixed on them throughout the encounter, creating an overwhelming sense that they were being studied rather than simply chased. When the couples finally reached the town limits of Point Pleasant, the creature broke off its pursuit and disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind 4 badly shaken witnesses who struggled to make sense of what they had experienced. Their decision to report the encounter to local law enforcement would prove to be a turning point in the town's history, as it marked the beginning of a wave of sightings that would continue for over a year and transform Point Pleasant into a destination for investigators, reporters, and curiosity seekers from around the world. Sheriff George Johnson, who took the initial report from the two couples, was initially skeptical of their claims, but was impressed by their obvious sincerity and the consistency of their accounts. Johnson knew all 4 witnesses personally and considered them to be reliable, level-headed individuals who were not prone to exaggeration or attention-seeking behavior. When he accompanied them back to the TNT area later that night to investigate the site of their encounter, Johnson discovered physical evidence that supported their story. Large, unidentifiable tracks in the soft earth near the power plant and broken tree branches at a height that suggested something very large had recently passed through the area. The publicity surrounding the Scarberry-Millette encounter triggered a flood of similar reports from throughout the Point Pleasant area, as residents who had been reluctant to discuss their own strange experiences came forward with accounts of encounters that had occurred weeks or months earlier. Many of these reports shared common elements with the initial sighting, descriptions of a large, winged creature with glowing red eyes that demonstrated obvious intelligence and supernatural abilities. Witnesses consistently reported that the creature seemed to be studying human activity rather than simply moving through its environment, and that it possessed the ability to appear and disappear in ways that suggested supernatural rather than natural origins. The TNT area became the focal point for most Mothman sightings, leading investigators to speculate about possible connections between the creature's presence and the abandoned military facility. The area contained numerous abandoned buildings, underground tunnels, and chemical storage sites that had been used for munitions production during World War II. Environmental testing conducted years later would reveal significant contamination from various chemical compounds, leading some researchers to theorize that the Mothman might be a mutated animal created by exposure to military chemicals. However, this theory failed to account for the creature's apparent supernatural abilities and high level of intelligence. As reports of Mothman encounters continued to accumulate throughout 1967, a pattern began to emerge that suggested the creature was not simply a random anomaly, but part of a larger phenomenon affecting the entire Point Pleasant area. Witnesses reported unusual electromagnetic disturbances in the vicinity of Mothman sightings, including television and radio interference, telephone malfunctions, and car engines that stalled or failed to start. These effects were not limited to the immediate vicinity of sightings, but seemed to affect electronic equipment throughout the town during periods of high Mothman activity. Even more disturbing were reports of prophetic dreams and visions experienced by witnesses who had encountered the Mothman. Multiple individuals reported having vivid nightmares about disasters and catastrophes in the weeks following their sightings, dreams that were often accompanied by images of the red-eyed creature watching from a distance. Some witnesses reported receiving telepathic messages that they believed originated from the Mothman, messages that often contained warnings about future events or cryptic references to danger facing the community. The most famous of these prophetic experiences was reported by Connie Carpenter, a Point Pleasant resident who claimed to have had repeated encounters with the Mothman throughout 1967. Carpenter reported that the creature had been attempting to communicate with her telepathically, sending messages that she interpreted as warnings about an impending disaster that would affect the entire community. According to Carpenter, the Mothman's messages became increasingly urgent and specific as 1967 progressed, culminating in visions of a catastrophic bridge collapse that would occur during the Christmas season. Carpenter's warnings were largely dismissed by local authorities and most residents, who viewed her claims as the fantasies of someone seeking attention or struggling with mental health issues. However, her predictions would take on a horrifying significance on December 15, 1967. When the Silver Bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, catastrophically collapsed during evening rush hour traffic. The bridge, which had been a vital transportation link for the community since 1928, failed without warning, sending 46 vehicles and their occupants plunging into the icy waters of the Ohio River below. The Silver Bridge collapse was one of the deadliest infrastructure failures in American history, claiming 46 lives and traumatizing the Point Pleasant community in ways that continue to affect residents today. The official investigation determined that the collapse was caused by the failure of a single eye-bar in the bridge's suspension system, a failure that created a chain reaction that brought down the entire structure in less than a minute. However, the timing of the collapse, coming at the height of the Mothman phenomenon and just weeks after Connie Carpenter's specific warnings about a bridge disaster, convinced many residents that the creature had been trying to warn them about the impending tragedy. In the immediate aftermath of the Silver Bridge collapse, Mothman sightings in the Point Pleasant area dropped dramatically, leading to speculation that the creature's presence had been somehow connected to the impending disaster. Some investigators theorized that the Mothman was a harbinger of doom, appearing in areas where catastrophic events were about to occur. Others suggested that the creature might have been trying to prevent the disaster by warning susceptible individuals like Connie Carpenter, but had been unable to communicate its message effectively enough to prevent the tragedy. The connection between the Mothman and the Silver Bridge collapse was popularized by journalist John Keel, whose 1975 book, The Mothman Prophecies, documented the entire 13-month period of sightings and established the creature as one of America's most famous cryptids. Keel's investigation revealed patterns in the Mothman encounters that suggested the creature possessed not only supernatural abilities, but also some form of precognitive knowledge about future events. His work demonstrated that many witnesses had reported prophetic dreams and visions that later proved to be accurate, though often in ways that were too cryptic to be useful for preventing the predicted disasters. Modern investigators who have studied the Mothman phenomenon using contemporary research methods have been unable to provide definitive explanations for the encounters that occurred in Point Pleasant between 1966 and 1967. The consistency of witness accounts, the physical evidence found at sighting locations, and the documented electromagnetic effects associated with the creature's presence all point to an encounter with something genuinely anomalous, rather than misidentification of known animals or psychological phenomena. The legacy of the Mothman continues to influence Point Pleasant today, with the town embracing its connection to the creature through festivals, statues, and tourism promotions that draw thousands of visitors annually. However, for older residents who lived through the original encounters and the Silver Bridge collapse, the Mothman remains a source of genuine unease and continued mystery. Many residents report ongoing sightings of the creature, though these encounters are typically much briefer and less dramatic than the original 1966 to 1967 wave. The Mothman of Point Pleasant represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of how the Appalachian Mountains can serve as a stage for encounters with forces that exist beyond our current understanding of the natural world. The creature's apparent ability to predict future disasters, its supernatural physical capabilities, and its obvious intelligence suggest that the ancient mountains and valleys of West Virginia may be home to entities that operate according to laws of physics and consciousness that science has yet to comprehend. For the residents of Point Pleasant, the Mothman serves as a permanent reminder that their community sits at the intersection of the known and unknown worlds, where the familiar landscape of coal mines and river valleys can suddenly become the domain of creatures that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of reality itself. Let's move to our ninth story. Between 1817 and 1821, the Bell family of Robertson County, Tennessee, endured what remains one of the most thoroughly documented cases of supernatural torment in American history. An ordeal so disturbing and well-witnessed that it attracted the attention of future President Andrew Jackson and established the Bell Witch as the most feared entity in Appalachian folklore. What began as strange noises and unexplained disturbances in a prosperous farming household escalated into a campaign of psychological and physical terror that drove one family member to his death and left an entire community questioning the nature of reality itself. The entity that terrorized the Bell family demonstrated intelligence, malevolence, and supernatural abilities that defied every attempt at rational explanation, creating a legacy of fear that continues to haunt the hills of Tennessee over 2 centuries later. John Bell was a respected farmer and community leader who had migrated to the fertile farmlands of Robertson County in the early 1800s, establishing a prosperous plantation along the Red River, where he raised tobacco and livestock while building a reputation as an honest businessman and devoted family man. Bell lived with his wife Lucy and their 9 children in a substantial 2-story log house that served as both family residence and community gathering place, where neighbors would come to discuss farming matters, share news, and participate in the social activities that bound rural communities together in the early American frontier. The Bell family's ordeal began in the summer of 1817, with what seemed like minor annoyances that could have been dismissed as natural phenomena if they had not persisted and escalated in ways that suggested deliberate intelligence behind the disturbances. John Bell first noticed unusual sounds coming from the walls of his house, scratching, gnawing, and tapping noises that seemed to move through the structure as if something were traveling within the walls themselves. Initially, Bell assumed that rats or other vermin had gotten into the house's construction, but when he investigated the sources of the sounds, he found no evidence of animal activity and no obvious explanation for the persistent noises. As weeks passed, the disturbances grew more frequent and more disturbing, expanding beyond simple sounds to include physical manifestations that could not be explained through natural causes. Family members began reporting that their bed covers were being pulled off during the night by invisible hands, that their hair was being pulled and twisted while they slept, and that they were being slapped and pinched by forces they could not see or resist. The attacks seemed to focus particularly on the Bells' youngest daughter, Betsy, who was 12 years old when the phenomena began, and who would become the primary target of the entity's malevolent attention throughout the 4-year ordeal. The invisible entity that tormented the Bell family quickly demonstrated that it possessed not only the ability to manipulate physical objects, but also intelligence and personality characteristics that suggested it was more than simply a random supernatural phenomenon. The entity began communicating with the family through a variety of means, starting with simple responses to questions through knocking sounds and progressing to actual speech that emerged from thin air without any visible source. The voice that spoke to the Bell family was described by witnesses as being distinctly feminine, with a tone that could shift from sweet and childlike to harsh and threatening depending on the entity's apparent mood. As the entity's communication abilities developed, it began identifying itself and explaining its presence in the Bell household, though its explanations were often contradictory and seemed designed more to confuse and frighten than to provide genuine information. At various times, the entity claimed to be the spirit of a Native American whose burial ground had been disturbed by Bell's farming activities, the ghost of a neighbor woman who had died under suspicious circumstances, and a demon sent to punish the Bell family for unspecified sins. Most persistently, the entity claimed to be the spirit of Kate Batts, an eccentric neighbor woman who had been involved in a land dispute with John Bell and who had reportedly cursed the Bell family before her death. The entity's claimed identity as Kate Batts led to its popular designation as the Bell Witch, though the supernatural manifestations bore little resemblance to traditional folklore about witches and their abilities. The Bell Witch demonstrated powers that seemed to transcend normal supernatural categories, including the ability to be present in multiple locations simultaneously, to know events that were occurring at great distances, and to predict future occurrences with unsettling accuracy. The entity seemed to possess unlimited knowledge about the private affairs of the Bell family and their neighbors, revealing secrets and hidden information that no human could have known through normal means. Word of the Bell family's supernatural torment spread rapidly through Robertson County and beyond, drawing visitors from throughout Tennessee and neighboring states who came to witness the phenomena for themselves. The Bell House became a destination for curiosity seekers, journalists, and investigators who hoped to document or debunk the reported supernatural activity. What they found consistently supported the Bell family's claims and added credible witness testimony to what was already becoming one of the most thoroughly documented paranormal cases in American history. Among the notable visitors to the Bell farm was Andrew Jackson, who was serving as a general in the Tennessee militia and would later become the 7th President of the United States. Jackson arrived with a party of men intending to investigate the Bell Witch phenomena and potentially expose what he assumed would prove to be an elaborate hoax. However, Jackson and his companions experienced supernatural manifestations that convinced them of the reality of the entity's presence and sent them fleeing from the Bell property after a single night of terror that Jackson would later describe as the most frightening experience of his military career. The Bell Witch's treatment of visitors revealed a pattern of behavior that suggested the entity possessed not only intelligence, but also the ability to judge human character and respond accordingly. Visitors who approached the phenomena with respect and genuine curiosity were often treated to relatively benign demonstrations of the entity's abilities, while those who came with hostile intentions or hopes of debunking the supernatural activity were subjected to terrifying attacks that left them convinced of the reality of forces beyond human understanding. The entity's interactions with the Bell family members also followed patterns that suggested deliberate psychological manipulation designed to create maximum distress and disruption to normal family life. John Bell, as the head of the household, became a particular target of the entity's hostility, with the Bell Witch claiming that it intended to kill him and frequently subjecting him to physical attacks that left him weak and increasingly ill. The entity seemed to take pleasure in tormenting Bell in front of his family and visitors, demonstrating its power over the man who should have been able to protect his household from harm. Betsy Bell, as the youngest family member and the primary focus of the entity's attention, experienced manifestations that were particularly disturbing in their intensity and apparent malevolence. The Bell Witch would pull her hair so violently that observers feared for her safety, slap her with such force that the marks remained visible for days, and subject her to verbal abuse that was both cruel and surprisingly sophisticated for an entity that claimed to be the spirit of a dead neighbor woman. The psychological impact on young Betsy was severe, with family members reporting that she began showing signs of serious emotional distress and physical illness that physicians could not explain or treat effectively. The Bell Witch demonstrated knowledge and abilities that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Bell property, accurately reporting events that were occurring in distant locations and predicting future occurrences with a precision that suggested either supernatural foresight or access to information through means that transcended normal human communication channels. The entity would describe conversations that were taking place in neighboring towns, predict the outcomes of business transactions that had not yet been completed, and provide detailed information about the private lives of people who had never visited the Bell farm. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Bell Witch phenomena was the entity's apparent ability to manipulate physical reality in ways that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics and chemistry. The entity could cause objects to appear and disappear at will, transport items from one location to another instantaneously, and produce substances such as food and drink that appeared to be genuine, but whose origins were completely inexplicable. Witnesses reported seeing the entity serve elaborate meals that materialized from nowhere, complete with dishes, utensils, and food that tasted normal, but vanished completely when the meal was finished. The Bell Witch's campaign against John Bell intensified throughout 1820, with the entity's attacks becoming more frequent and more severe as the farmer's health declined under the constant stress and supernatural assault. Family members and visitors reported that John Bell appeared to be aging rapidly, losing weight and strength in ways that could not be attributed to any known medical condition. Local physicians who examined Bell found no obvious cause for his deterioration, though they noted symptoms that suggested he was being systematically poisoned by some unknown substance. On December 20th, 1820, John Bell died under circumstances that convinced his family and the broader community that the Bell Witch had succeeded in its often stated goal of killing the family patriarch. On the morning of his death, family members found Bell unconscious and discovered a strange vial containing an unknown liquid near his bedside. When they questioned the Bell Witch about the vial's contents, the entity laughingly claimed responsibility for Bell's condition and boasted that it had poisoned him with a substance that no human physician could identify or counteract. When a family member tested the liquid by giving a small amount to the family cat, the animal died instantly, confirming the deadly nature of the substance. Following John Bell's death, the Bell Witch's behavior changed dramatically, shifting from malevolent hostility to apparent satisfaction with having achieved its primary objective. The entity announced that it would be leaving the Bell family in peace, though it promised to return in 7 years to continue its harassment. The supernatural manifestations that had plagued the Bell household for over 3 years began to diminish rapidly, with the entity making fewer appearances and demonstrating less dramatic abilities before finally disappearing entirely in early 1821. True to its promise, the Bell Witch returned to the Bell farm in 1828, though its second manifestation was much briefer and less intense than the original haunting. The entity appeared primarily to John Bell, Jr., who had inherited the family property and engaged in conversations about family matters and predictions about future events. This second visitation lasted only a few weeks before the entity announced that it would not return for another 107 years, a prediction that would place its next appearance in 1935. The legacy of the Bell Witch extends far beyond the immediate impact on the Bell family, establishing a template for supernatural activity that would influence American folklore and paranormal investigation for generations. The case was remarkable for the number of credible witnesses who testified to the reality of the phenomena, the consistency of accounts provided by different observers, and the documentation of events by educated individuals who had no obvious motive for perpetuating a hoax. Modern investigators who have studied the Bell Witch case using contemporary research methods have been unable to provide satisfactory explanations for the reported phenomena, despite extensive analysis of historical records, witness testimony, and physical evidence from the site of the original haunting. The case remains one of the most compelling examples of documented supernatural activity in American history, with elements that continue to defy rational explanation even when subjected to skeptical investigation. The Bell Witch case represents a particularly disturbing example of how the ancient landscape of the Appalachian region can serve as a stage for encounters with forces that operate beyond human understanding or control. The entity that tormented the Bell family demonstrated abilities and knowledge that suggested it existed outside normal categories of supernatural phenomena, possessing intelligence, malevolence, and power that made it one of the most feared entities in American folklore. For the residents of Robertson County and the broader Appalachian region, the Bell Witch serves as a permanent reminder that the hills and valleys of Tennessee may harbor forces that can intrude into human affairs with devastating consequences. The case established a precedent for supernatural activity in the region that continues to influence local folklore and serves as a warning that some mysteries are better left uninvestigated, lest they attract the attention of entities that view human curiosity as an invitation to demonstrate their power over mortal affairs. The Bell Witch phenomenon demonstrates that the Appalachian Mountains have long been home to forces that exist beyond the boundaries of human comprehension, forces that can enter our world and reshape it according to their own mysterious purposes. For those who understand the deeper patterns of supernatural activity in the region, the Bell Witch represents not an isolated historical curiosity, but a glimpse into the true nature of the ancient powers that continue to inhabit the hills and hollows of the Appalachian wilderness, waiting for opportunities to remind humanity that we are not alone in this world, and that some neighbors are far more dangerous than others. Let's move to our 10th story. For over a century, the coal mining regions of Kentucky and West Virginia have been plagued by industrial disasters that claimed thousands of lives. But beneath the official statistics and corporate investigations lies a disturbing pattern of unexplained deaths, systematic cover-ups, and evidence that suggests some of the mining tragedies in the Appalachian Mountains were not simply accidents, but the result of deliberate negligence, corporate conspiracy, and encounters with forces deep underground that the mining companies have worked desperately to conceal from public scrutiny. The coal industry's stranglehold on Appalachian communities has enabled a culture of silence and intimidation that has allowed mining deaths to be systematically misrepresented, families to be denied justice, and evidence of supernatural encounters in the deepest mine shafts to be buried along with the miners who experience them. The coal mining industry came to dominate the Appalachian region in the late 1800s, transforming isolated mountain communities into company towns, where every aspect of life was controlled by mining corporations that viewed human workers as expendable resources to be consumed in the pursuit of profit. These companies established a feudal system where miners lived in company housing, shopped at company stores, and found themselves perpetually indebted to their employers through a system of economic control that made it impossible for workers to leave, even when they became aware of dangerous working conditions that threatened their lives. The official records maintained by mining companies and government agencies document thousands of deaths in Appalachian coal mines. But these statistics represent only a fraction of the true human cost of coal extraction in the region. Independent researchers who have studied mining death records have found consistent patterns of underreporting, with many deaths being classified as accidents or natural causes, when evidence suggests they resulted from criminal negligence or conditions that mining companies knew were deadly but chose to ignore in order to maintain production schedules and profit margins. One of the most disturbing aspects of coal mining deaths in Appalachia is the frequency with which miners' bodies were never recovered. Despite the fact that mining companies possessed detailed maps of mine layouts and had access to the locations where workers were known to have been when disasters occurred, families were told that cave-ins or explosions had made body recovery impossible. But many of these explanations were inconsistent with the physical evidence and geological realities of the mine sites. In numerous cases, mines where workers had supposedly been trapped and killed continued operating in adjacent areas within days of the reported disasters, suggesting that the actual conditions were not as catastrophic as families had been led to believe. The mining companies' control over local law enforcement, medical examiners, and government officials enabled systematic cover-ups of mining deaths that might have attracted unwanted attention or legal liability. County coroners who were financially dependent on mining company support routinely issued death certificates that attributed mining fatalities to natural causes or unpreventable accidents, even when evidence clearly indicated negligence or safety violations. Local newspapers, which relied on mining company advertising revenue, rarely investigated suspicious mining deaths or challenged official explanations that defied common sense. Miners who survived unexplained incidents in the deeper shafts of Appalachian coal mines frequently reported encounters that their employers were eager to suppress and that the miners themselves were reluctant to discuss publicly due to fear of losing their jobs or being dismissed as mentally unstable. These accounts consistently described experiences in the deepest mining areas, where workers encountered sounds, sights, and phenomena that could not be explained through normal industrial activity or geological processes. Miners reported hearing voices calling from areas of mines where no other workers were present, seeing lights moving through abandoned shafts that had been sealed for decades, and feeling the presence of something watching them from the darkness beyond their headlamp's reach. The most disturbing reports from coal miners involved encounters with entities or presences that seemed to inhabit the deepest areas of the mines, particularly in sections where mining operations had broken through into natural cave systems or underground waterways that had existed in the Appalachian Mountains for millions of years. Miners working in these areas described feeling observed by intelligences that seemed ancient and malevolent. Entities that resented the human intrusion into their underground domain, and that possessed the ability to cause equipment failures, structural collapses, and other disasters that would be attributed to natural causes by investigators who never ventured into the affected areas. Multiple mining disasters in the region followed patterns that suggested they were not random accidents, but deliberate actions taken by forces that wanted to prevent further human penetration into specific underground areas. Mines that had been operating safely for years would suddenly experience catastrophic failures immediately after breaking through into previously unexplored cave systems or reaching depths that had never before been accessed by human activity. These disasters often occurred in ways that trapped or killed the miners who had been working in the newly opened areas, while leaving workers in other parts of the mine unharmed, as if something was selectively targeting those who had penetrated too deeply into forbidden territory. The environmental devastation caused by coal mining in Appalachia has created conditions that may have awakened or disturbed entities that had been dormant in the deep underground systems of the region. Strip mining operations that remove entire mountaintops expose underground waterways and cave systems that had been sealed for millennia, while deep shaft mining penetrates geological formations that have been undisturbed since the mountains were formed. Miners and environmental activists have reported that areas subjected to intensive mining activity experience increases in unexplained phenomena, including strange sounds emanating from abandoned mine shafts, unusual electromagnetic activity that interferes with electronic equipment, and sightings of lights and figures moving through areas where no human activity should be occurring. The mining company's response to reports of supernatural activity in their operations has been to systematically suppress any information that might suggest their workers are encountering unexplained dangers in the mines. Workers who report unusual experiences are often transferred to surface operations, subjected to psychological evaluations that question their mental stability, or terminated on pretexts that prevent them from discussing their underground encounters. Mining company security personnel have been known to confiscate cameras and recording equipment from miners who attempted to document unusual phenomena, and written reports of strange incidents are routinely destroyed or classified in ways that prevent their disclosure to families, investigators, or government agencies. The families of miners who died in unexplained circumstances often faced intimidation and economic pressure, designed to prevent them from pursuing investigations into the true causes of their loved ones' deaths. Mining companies would offer small financial settlements that required families to sign non-disclosure agreements, preventing them from discussing the circumstances of mining deaths or pursuing legal action against the companies. Families who refused these settlements often found themselves blacklisted from employment in the mining industry, evicted from company housing, and subjected to harassment that made it impossible for them to remain in their communities. Independent investigators who have attempted to document mining-related deaths and cover-ups in Appalachia have encountered systematic obstruction from mining companies, local governments, and law enforcement agencies that have financial relationships with the coal industry. Mine records that should be public documents are often declared lost or destroyed, while government inspection reports are heavily redacted in ways that remove information about specific incidents or safety violations. Journalists and researchers who persist in investigating mining deaths have faced threats, legal harassment, and in some cases physical intimidation designed to prevent them from exposing the truth about conditions in Appalachian coal mines. The health effects experienced by coal miners extend beyond the well-documented problems of black lung disease and industrial injuries to include psychological and neurological symptoms that suggest exposure to environmental factors that are not acknowledged in official health studies. Miners who work in the deepest areas of coal mines report experiencing persistent nightmares, episodes of missing time, and psychological distress that appears to be connected to their underground experiences rather than simply the stress of dangerous working conditions. Medical professionals who have examined affected miners have found symptoms consistent with exposure to electromagnetic fields, infrasound, or other environmental factors that could affect brain function. But mining companies have refused to allow comprehensive health studies that might identify the specific causes of these symptoms. The generational impact of coal mining deaths and cover-ups on Appalachian families has created a culture of fear and resignation that enables the continued exploitation of mining communities by corporate interests that view human life as an acceptable cost of coal extraction. Children grow up knowing that their fathers and grandfathers died in mines under suspicious circumstances, but also understanding that questioning official explanations or seeking justice for mining deaths will result in economic retaliation against their families. This atmosphere of intimidation has prevented the formation of effective advocacy groups or legal challenges that might force mining companies to acknowledge the true human cost of their operations. The environmental legacy of coal mining in Appalachia includes not only the obvious devastation of strip mining and mountaintop removal, but also the contamination of underground water systems and the disruption of geological formations that may have served as barriers preventing the release of natural forces that are better left undisturbed. Environmental scientists who have studied the long-term effects of coal mining have found evidence of chemical contamination, radioactive materials, and geological instability that may persist for centuries after mining operations cease, creating ongoing dangers for communities that continue to live in areas affected by coal extraction. The connection between coal mining activities and increased reports of supernatural phenomena in affected areas suggests that the industrial-scale disruption of ancient geological formations may have consequences that extend beyond environmental and health impacts, to include encounters with forces that have been sealed underground for geological ages. Local folklore from coal mining regions consistently includes stories about entities that emerge from abandoned mines, lights that move through areas where mining operations have disturbed the earth, and sounds that emanate from the ground in areas where deep mining has occurred. The decline of the coal industry in recent decades has not ended the suffering of Appalachian mining communities, as abandoned mines continue to pose environmental and safety hazards, while the economic devastation caused by mine closures has left entire communities without viable employment alternatives. Abandoned mine shafts and processing facilities have become sources of ongoing contamination and safety hazards, while the mining companies that created these problems have often declared bankruptcy or reorganized in ways that allow them to avoid responsibility for cleanup and remediation costs. The legacy of coal mining deaths and cover-ups in Appalachia represents one of the most shameful chapters in American industrial history, demonstrating how corporate power can be used to systematically exploit and endanger human life while suppressing evidence of the true costs of industrial activity. The mining company's ability to control information, intimidate witnesses, and avoid accountability for mining deaths has created a culture of impunity that continues to affect Appalachian communities even as the coal industry declines. For the families who lost loved ones in suspicious mining incidents, the cover-ups and intimidation tactics employed by mining companies have created a form of ongoing trauma that extends across generations, as children and grandchildren continue to seek answers about deaths that were systematically misrepresented and concealed. The environmental and health impacts of coal mining will persist in Appalachian communities for decades to come. While the supernatural phenomena reported in connection with mining activities continue to affect residents who live near abandoned mine sites and areas where mining operations disturbed ancient underground systems, the coal mining industry's legacy in Appalachia serves as a warning about the consequences of allowing corporate interests to operate without effective oversight or accountability. particularly in isolated communities where economic dependence makes it difficult for residents to resist exploitation or demand justice for industrial crimes. The pattern of mining deaths, cover-ups, and environmental devastation that has characterized coal extraction in the region demonstrates how corporate power can be used to systematically victimize entire communities while suppressing evidence of the true human and environmental costs of industrial activity. The mysterious deaths and unexplained phenomena associated with coal mining in Appalachia suggest that the region's ancient mountains may harbor forces that are disturbed by industrial-scale disruption of geological formations that have remained stable for millions of years. The mining companies' systematic suppression of information about supernatural encounters in their operations indicates that they may have been aware of dangers that extended beyond conventional industrial hazards, but chose to conceal this information rather than acknowledge risks that might have threatened their ability to continue extracting coal from areas where such encounters occurred. Let's move to our 11th story. Long before European colonists set foot in the Appalachian Mountains, the Cherokee people spoke in whispered tones of the Kituwa, the ancient ones they called the Moon-Eyed people. Pale-skinned beings who had once inhabited the highest peaks and deepest valleys of what would become the North Carolina and Georgia border region. According to Cherokee oral tradition passed down through countless generations, these mysterious entities possessed eyes so sensitive to sunlight that they could only emerge from their underground dwellings during the darkest nights, when the moon provided the only illumination they could tolerate. The Cherokee described them as master builders who constructed elaborate stone fortifications and underground cities throughout the Appalachian Range, but who vanished suddenly and completely sometime before the Cherokee themselves migrated into the region, leaving behind only their massive stoneworks and disturbing evidence that some of their kind might still survive in the deepest caves and most remote valleys of the ancient mountains. The Cherokee accounts of the Moon-Eyed people are remarkably consistent across different tribal communities and time periods, suggesting that these stories represent genuine historical memories rather than simple folklore or mythological creation. Tribal elders described the Moon-Eyed people as being roughly human in appearance, but noticeably different in their physical characteristics. Taller than typical humans, with extremely pale skin that appeared almost translucent in moonlight, and most distinctively, large eyes that reflected light like those of nocturnal animals, but which could not function in bright daylight. The Cherokee emphasized that these beings were not spirits or supernatural entities, but physical creatures who lived, worked, and built structures that could still be seen and explored by anyone willing to venture into the most remote areas of the mountains. The stone structures attributed to the Moon-Eyed people represent some of the most puzzling archaeological anomalies in the southeastern United States, with construction techniques and architectural designs that do not match any known Native American building traditions or European colonial methods. These structures, scattered throughout the highest elevations of the North Carolina and Georgia mountains, include massive stone walls built without mortar, complex drainage systems carved directly into bedrock, and underground chambers accessed through narrow passages that seem designed for beings who preferred darkness and confined spaces to open-air living. The most extensively documented of these structures is located near Murphy, North Carolina, where a series of stone walls and terraced platforms cover several acres of mountainside terrain that would have required enormous labor and sophisticated engineering knowledge to construct. The walls are built from carefully fitted stones, some weighing several tons, that were quarried from locations miles away and transported to the construction site using methods that remain unexplained. The precision of the stonework rivals that found in ancient civilizations known for their masonry skills. Yet the structures show no evidence of having been built by any known historical culture that inhabited the region. Archaeological investigations of the Moon-Eyed people sites have been limited by their remote locations and the reluctance of academic institutions to seriously study structures that do not fit established theories about pre-Columbian American civilizations. However, the limited excavations that have been conducted have revealed artifacts and construction details that suggest the builders possessed technological knowledge that was far advanced compared to other cultures known to have existed in the region during the same time period. Stone tools found at the sites show evidence of metallurgical knowledge, with cutting edges that appear to have been enhanced using techniques that were not developed by European cultures until much later periods. The Cherokee oral traditions provide specific details about the Moon-Eyed people's way of life that offer insights into how these mysterious beings might have survived in the challenging Appalachian environment. According to tribal accounts, the Moon-Eyed people were primarily subterranean dwellers who had developed sophisticated methods for living underground, including the cultivation of food crops in artificial cave systems and the development of complex water management systems that allowed them to thrive in areas where surface water was scarce or unreliable. The Cherokee described elaborate underground cities where the Moon-Eyed people lived in communities that could support hundreds or thousands of individuals without requiring contact with the surface world. The Cherokee accounts also described the Moon-Eyed people as possessing knowledge and abilities that seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. Though the tribal descriptions suggest these were natural capabilities that had been developed through generations of adaptation to their unique environment. The Moon-Eyed people were said to be able to move through underground passage systems that connected distant mountain peaks, allowing them to travel great distances without ever appearing on the surface, where they might be seen by other inhabitants of the region. They were also described as having developed methods for communicating across long distances using sound systems that utilize the natural acoustics of cave networks and underground water systems. The disappearance of the Moon-Eyed people from Cherokee oral tradition is described as having occurred suddenly and completely, with no gradual decline or obvious cause that would explain why an entire civilization would vanish from a region where they had apparently thrived for generations. Cherokee elders tell of a great battle that was fought between their ancestors and the Moon-Eyed people. But the details of this conflict are vague and contradictory, with some accounts suggesting that the Moon-Eyed people were driven away through warfare, while others imply that they retreated voluntarily into the deepest areas of the mountains, where they would be completely isolated from human contact. Modern Cherokee descendants, who maintain connections to traditional knowledge, often express reluctance to discuss the Moon-Eyed people in detail, suggesting that some aspects of their ancestors' encounters with these beings remain sensitive or dangerous topics that are not appropriate for casual discussion. Tribal members who are willing to share information about the Moon-Eyed people often emphasize that their ancestors believed some of these beings might still survive in the most remote areas of the mountains, and about living in underground communities that have remained hidden from human contact for centuries. The geographical distribution of sites attributed to the Moon-Eyed people corresponds closely to areas of the Appalachian Mountains that continue to be associated with unexplained phenomena and supernatural encounters in modern times. The highest concentration of Moon-Eyed people sites is found in the mountainous regions along the North Carolina-Georgia border, particularly in areas that are characterized by extensive cave systems, underground water networks, and geological formations that would provide ideal conditions for subterranean communities. These same areas are frequently reported as locations where modern hikers, hunters, and explorers encounter unusual lights, sounds, and phenomena that suggest the presence of intelligent beings who prefer to remain hidden from human observation. Local residents of Appalachian communities near known Moon-Eyed people sites often possess generational knowledge about areas that should be avoided or approached with caution, knowledge that is typically shared through family traditions rather than formal community discussions. These informal warnings often focus on specific cave systems, remote valleys, and high mountain areas where people have reported encountering pale figures, unusual lights, or unexplained sounds that might indicate the continued presence of beings who match the traditional descriptions of the Moon-Eyed People. The connection between Moon-Eyed People sites and modern unexplained phenomena has attracted the attention of researchers interested in cryptozoology and anomalous archaeology, though serious academic study of these connections has been limited by the controversial nature of the subject matter and the difficulty of obtaining reliable data from remote mountain locations. Independent researchers who have conducted investigations in areas associated with the Moon-Eyed People report finding evidence that suggests some of the underground structures attributed to these beings may still be in use, including signs of recent maintenance, artificial lighting systems, and indications that the cave networks are being actively monitored by beings who do not want their presence discovered. The most disturbing modern encounters with entities that match the traditional descriptions of Moon-Eyed People have been reported by individuals who are exploring the deepest and most remote cave systems in the North Carolina and Georgia mountains. These witnesses describe encountering pale, tall figures with large, reflective eyes who seem to be perfectly adapted to underground environments and who demonstrate obvious intelligence and technological capabilities that far exceed what would be expected from primitive cave dwellers. The encounters typically occur in areas where the witnesses had penetrated deeper underground than previous explorers, suggesting that the Moon-Eyed People may still maintain extensive communities in areas that remain inaccessible to casual human exploration. The technological capabilities demonstrated by modern Moon-Eyed People encounters include sophisticated lighting systems that do not appear to rely on fire or conventional electrical power, communication methods that allow them to coordinate activities across large underground networks, and construction techniques that enable them to modify cave systems and create new passages through solid rock. Witnesses describe encountering evidence of large-scale underground agriculture, water management systems that redirect underground streams and rivers, and manufacturing activities that produce tools and materials using methods that are not understood by surface-dwelling humans. The psychological impact of Moon-Eyed People encounters on witnesses is typically profound and long-lasting, with many individuals reporting permanent changes in their worldview and relationship with the natural environment after discovering evidence of an advanced civilization that has remained hidden beneath the Appalachian Mountains for centuries. These encounters challenge fundamental assumptions about human history, technological development, and the possibility that other intelligent species might share our planet without our knowledge or consent. The potential continued existence of Moon-Eyed People communities in the deepest areas of the Appalachian Mountains raises disturbing questions about what other secrets might be hidden in the ancient cave systems and underground networks that extend throughout the mountain range. If beings matching the traditional descriptions of the Moon-Eyed People have survived in underground communities for centuries without human knowledge, it suggests that our understanding of the Appalachian region's natural history and current inhabitants is far more limited than we realize. The Moon-Eyed People phenomenon represents one of the most compelling examples of how Native American oral traditions might preserve accurate historical information about encounters with non-human intelligences that have shaped the development of human communities in the Appalachian region. The Cherokee accounts of these beings provide detailed descriptions of their physical characteristics, technological capabilities, and social organization that are consistent with modern reports of encounters with similar entities, suggesting that the oral traditions represent genuine historical memories rather than mythological stories. The stone structures and archaeological evidence associated with the Moon-Eyed People continue to challenge conventional understanding of pre-Columbian American civilizations and suggest that the technological and social development of ancient American cultures may have been far more advanced and complex than mainstream archaeology acknowledges. The engineering sophistication demonstrated in Moon-Eyed People construction projects indicates knowledge of metallurgy, mathematics, and architectural principles that were supposedly unknown in the Americas until European contact. The environmental impact of potential moon-eyed people communities on the Appalachian ecosystem might explain some of the unusual characteristics of cave systems and underground water networks in areas where their sites are concentrated. If these beings have been actively managing underground environments for centuries, they may have created artificial ecosystems that support forms of life and geological processes that would not occur naturally, contributing to the unique characteristics that make the Appalachian region distinct from other mountain ranges. The secrecy and isolation that characterize potential modern moon-eyed people communities suggest that these beings have developed sophisticated methods for avoiding human contact while maintaining their traditional way of life in the changing environment of the modern Appalachian region. Their apparent success in remaining hidden for centuries while human populations and industrial activity have transformed the surface world indicates technological and social capabilities that far exceed what would be expected from primitive cave-dwelling communities. The moon-eyed people legend serves as a reminder that the Appalachian Mountains have been home to intelligent beings for far longer than recorded human history, and that our current understanding of who and what inhabits these ancient peaks may be incomplete in ways that we are only beginning to discover. For the Cherokee people, the moon-eyed people represent a connection between their own history and the deeper mysteries of the mountains they have called home for generations. While for modern researchers and explorers, these beings represent one of the most intriguing possibilities for discovering evidence of non-human intelligence that has coexisted with human civilization without our awareness. The possibility that moon-eyed people communities continue to exist in the deepest areas of the Appalachian Mountains challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about the natural world and the potential for discovering forms of life and intelligence that have remained hidden from mainstream human society. Their story suggests that the ancient mountains of Appalachia may still harbor secrets that could revolutionize our understanding of human history, technological development, and the possibility that we share our world with intelligences that operate according to principles and priorities that we have yet to comprehend. As we conclude our journey through these 11 disturbing true stories from the Appalachian Mountains, remember that the ancient peaks and hollows we've explored tonight continue to guard their secrets jealously. If you found yourself captivated by these mysteries, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to join the Verified Fears community, where we never stop digging deeper into the cases that others dare not touch. Drop a comment below telling me which of these 11 stories will haunt your dreams tonight. And remember, when you're out there in the wilderness, whether it's the Appalachian Trail or any remote location, always tell someone exactly where you're going and when you expect to return. The mountains have been claiming the unprepared for centuries, and in a world where cell service fails and GPS devices malfunction, your survival might depend on someone knowing where to look for you when you don't come home.